We are opening the pages of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
Hmm.
And this is really a book that fundamentally altered the entire landscape of human thought.
It absolutely did.
We're looking specifically at the architecture he built across the first edition in 1781, and then that heavily revised second edition in 1787. Our mission here, as we step into this space, is to really map out one of the most profoundly influential philosophical frameworks ever constructed.
Yeah, it's a massive undertaking.
It is. But before we even cross the threshold of the text, we have to kind of pause right at the door, because the very title contains a word we need to define very carefully. When you hear the word critique today, it carries a lot of modern baggage.
Right, it does. Today, we naturally just think of a review.
Exactly.
We think of a critique of a film or a novel, or maybe someone writing a really harsh takedown of a competing philosophical system.
Yeah.
But Kant is incredibly specific here.
He's not doing that at all.
No, he is not writing a critique of other books or other thinkers. He is actually calling for a critique of the faculty of human reason itself.
Which is a distinction that completely changes how you read this book.
It changes everything. You really have to think of it as a tribunal. It's a courtroom where reason is literally being called to the witness stand to examine its own capabilities, and doing so entirely independent of all physical experience.
Like a rigorous self-examination.
Exactly. It's an investigation to determine what reason can actually know and where its absolute hard boundaries lie.
And to understand why Kant felt this intense, almost desperate need to put reason on trial, we really have to look at the state of philosophy at the time. While reading through this, I was really struck by the tragic, almost poetic metaphor Kant uses for the discipline of metaphysics.
The queen.
Yes, the queen. He says that metaphysics was once considered the queen of all sciences, and rightfully so, given the profound importance of the questions it asked. Questions about God, the soul, the origins of the universe.
But a queen who has lost her throne.
Precisely. By Kant's time, this queen had fallen into absolute ruin. He describes her as mourning, forlorn, forsaken. He actually compares her to the exiled Queen Hecuba from Greek mythology, just watching her city burn to the ground.
Because the realm of metaphysics had just descended into total anarchy by that point.
Right.
You had the rationalists whom Kant calls the dogmatists.
Right.
And they basically ruled like absolute despots. They were building these massive, towering systems of thought based entirely on unproven assumptions.
And then on the exact opposite side, you had the skeptics. And Kant compares them to nomadic tribes.
Which is such a vivid image.
It really is, because they didn't build cities. They just wandered through, periodically attacking and tearing down the established settlements of the dogmatists. So you're left with this chaotic, deeply exhausting intellectual landscape.
And the most formidable of those nomadic skeptics was the Scottish philosopher David Hume.
Yes. This is where the story gets incredibly tense.
It does. Because before Hume, the rationalist thinkers firmly believed that you could deduce the laws of the universe, things like cause and effect, purely through logical deduction.
Right, they thought you didn't even need to look at the world. You could just sit in a dark room and think your way to the fundamental truth.
Then Hume arrives and just sends a total shockwave through the intellectual world. He proved them completely wrong.
He argued that just because you observe one event following another event, that does not logically prove a necessary cause.
The billiard ball analogy is always the one that makes this click for me.
Oh, that's a perfect one. Let's walk through that.
So if you're watching a game of pool and you see a white cue ball roll across the table and hit a red ball, and then the red ball moves, your brain automatically says, well, the first ball caused the second one to move.
It feels like an undeniable fact.
Right. But Hume points out that logic alone doesn't actually dictate that it had to happen that way.
Yeah.
If you were, say, an alien who had never seen physical physics in action.
It's entirely fresh to the universe.
Exactly. You couldn't deduce what would happen just by looking at a stationary ball. You actually have to experience it. Therefore, our belief in cause and effect, Hume argued, is merely a psychological habit.
A habit. That's the terrifying word for a rationalist.
It is. It's just an expectation built on repeated experience.
Yeah.
It's not a strict, unbreakable, logical necessity.
And it's so easy to see why someone raised entirely within that rationalist tradition, like Kant was, would look at Hume's metaphorical wrecking ball and just completely panic.
Oh, he was devastated.
Because Kant trusted those logical structures, so when he read Hume, he was profoundly disturbed. If cause and effect is just a mental habit, then the floor falls out from under all human knowledge.
It threatens to collapse everything we think we know into mere illusion.
He was a true crisis. And it drove Kant into deep isolation. I mean, he spent 12 silent years working through a solution to save human knowledge from this skeptical abyss.
Just an unbelievable amount of mental labor. And the result of those 12 years is the book we are walking through right now.
So, to save philosophy, Kant realized he had to actually look outside of it. He looked to the hard sciences, specifically mathematics and physics, because they had actually managed to find a secure, progressive path forward.
They weren't stuck in the mud like metaphysics.
Right. And he points to these specific historical moments of scientific awakening.
Like Galileo rolling balls of specific weights down inclined planes.
Mm.
Or Torricelli calculating the weight of a column of water before he actually physically measured it.
Kant says a light broke upon natural philosophers in those exact moments.
Because they finally realized why they were succeeding. Where previous generations of philosophers had completely failed, the breakthrough was a change in their fundamental posture.
Reason should not approach nature like a passive pupil, just sitting in the back of the classroom hoping nature will graciously reveal its secrets to you.
No, reason must act like an appointed judge. It must compel nature to answer specific, preconceived questions according to unvarying laws.
The scientist sets up the experiment. The scientist brings the framework to the table.
Which perfectly brings us to what might be the most fascinating idea in the book Kant's Copernican Revolution.
Yes. When I was looking through your notes on this, the analogy to Nicholas Copernicus was just the ultimate light bulb moment for me.
It works so beautifully.
It really does. Because for centuries, astronomers were pulling their hair out trying to explain the complex, looping movements of the planets. They were operating under this massive assumption that the entire universe revolved around a spectator who was standing completely still on Earth.
But the math was an absolute mess. It required these increasingly bizarre, convoluted workarounds just to make basic sense of what they were seeing.
So Copernicus tries a radical experiment. He flips it, he assumes the stars are at rest, and he makes the spectator revolve.
And suddenly
the movements of the heavens make beautiful, elegant mathematical sense.
And Kant applies this exact same flip to human thought. Up to that point in philosophical history, it had been universally assumed that our human knowledge had to conform to objects.
We thought our minds were essentially like blank, passive mirrors, just quietly reflecting the reality of the objects sitting out there in the world.
But under that passive assumption, trying to figure out universal truths about those objects before you actually experience them, what Kant calls a priori knowledge, was completely impossible.
Because you couldn't know anything about the object until it stood right in front of your mirror.
Exactly. So Kant asked this incredibly revolutionary question: what if objects must conform to our cognition?
Let's really emphasize that. What if, before we even perceive an object, our mind is actively structuring, organizing, and shaping that reality?
Experience itself isn't just a passive reception. It is a mode of cognition that requires the mind to be actively working, formatting the raw data before we are even consciously aware of it.
I want to just sit with that for a second in this quiet space, because if our minds are actively shaping reality before we consciously perceive it, that creates a profound divide in how we experience the universe.
The literal split in reality.
It means there is a twofold sense of reality. On one side, we have things exactly as they appear to us, having already been filtered, processed, and structured by the lens of our human minds. And Kant calls these phenomena.
And then on the other side, there are things as they actually are in themselves, entirely independent of our human formatting. And he calls these noumena.
And this is where Kant's tribunal of reason hands down its absolute strictest ruling. It severely restricts what our minds are allowed to claim as truth.
It's a very hard limit.
According to Kant, we can only ever know phenomena. We can only have knowledge of the world as it appears to us because our mind is actively building that very appearance. We absolutely cannot have knowledge of things in themselves, the noumena.
They are completely beyond the limits of our sensory processing. We can think about them, sure. We can conceptualize them without contradicting ourselves, but we cannot claim to actually know them. We simply lack the equipment.
Now, you might be sitting there listening to this, wondering why this highly abstract limitation matters to you. Like, why should we care about this invisible divide between phenomena and noumena?
The moral stakes here are actually massive.
They're everything. Imagine if there was no divide. Imagine if everything in the universe was just phenomena, just physical objects interacting in space and time.
If that were true, everything, and I mean everything, including you, would be completely bound by the strict, unbroken laws of physical cause and effect.
You would be entirely subject to the mechanism of nature. In a purely phenomenal world, there is absolutely no logical room for free will.
None at all.
Every choice you make, every single thought you have would just be the inevitable mechanical result of prior physical causes, just like dominoes falling.
And this is where we see the brilliant protective maneuvering of Kant's critique. By proving that the strict laws of cause and effect only apply to the phenomenal world, the world of appearances that our minds format, he effectively builds a fortress around the human soul in the noumenal world.
There is a really famous line in the book where he declares that he had to abolish knowledge to make room for belief.
It's one of the greatest sentences in philosophy. By severely limiting what dogmatic atheists and fatalists could claim to know about the ultimate nature of reality, he completely silenced them.
He proved they couldn't possibly know what happens beyond the phenomenal veil.
Right. And in doing so, he secured a safe, untouchable logical space for free will, for morality, and for belief. Kant actually compares it to a system of police.
Oh, right, the police metaphor.
Yeah, the police limit certain freedoms to prevent violence so that citizens can safely go about their daily lives. In the same way, Kant limits speculative reason to prevent metaphysical violence, which then allows moral, practical reason to flourish in peace.
So, to understand how this mental filtering actually works in practice, we have to look at how Kant meticulously deconstructs human knowledge. He begins with a foundational premise, sort of a golden rule.
That all our knowledge begins with experience.
Yes. Our senses must be awakened by objects. A mind just floating in a dark void with absolutely no sensory input learns nothing.
But notice the very careful phrasing Kant uses here. Just because all knowledge begins with experience, it does not mean that all knowledge arises out of experience.
And to navigate that specific distinction, Kant rigorously defines two types of knowledge. The first is a posteriori.
Which is empirical knowledge.
Exactly. It is derived entirely from experience. So, for example, knowing that a particular coffee mug is warm is a posteriori. You have to physically touch it to know. You can't figure it out just by sitting there thinking about it.
But the second type is a priori. This is pure knowledge that exists absolutely independent of all sensory experience.
And Kant provides two strict, infallible tests for you to identify a priori knowledge. First, it must possess absolute necessity, meaning it must fundamentally be true. And second, it must have strict universality.
Meaning there are absolutely no possible exceptions anywhere in the universe.
Right, so let's unpack how we actually use these two types of knowledge by looking at the types of judgments we make in our daily lives. Kant categorizes our statements about the world into analytic and synthetic judgments.
And the difference essentially comes down to explicative statements versus augmentative statements.
Let's take an analytic judgment first. Kant uses the example, all bodies are extended, by which he means all physical bodies take up space.
Right, because if you strip away the space, you don't actually have a physical body anymore. You just have an abstract idea.
This is an analytic judgment because you do not need to look outside the concept of a body to know this. If you analyze the very definition of a physical body, the idea of taking up space is already packed inside it.
You are merely unpacking the box to see what was already placed inside. It is a truth of identity.
Synthetic judgments, on the other hand, add brand new information to the box. They synthesize. Kant's example here is all bodies are heavy.
Because if you take the pure abstract concept of a generic body, it doesn't automatically contain the concept of weight.
No, it doesn't. Weight implies gravity, mass, physical interaction. You actually have to combine the concept of a body with your outside experience of physics to make that judgment.
So synthetic judgments augment your knowledge. They attach a new predicate that simply wasn't hidden inside the original subject.
And this brings us to what might genuinely be Kant's ultimate discovery, the massive blind spot that had trapped philosophy for centuries.
It's a huge turning point. Because before Kant, everyone, and that includes David Hume, operated under a very strict binary. They believed that all a priori truths, the purely logical, necessary ones, had to be analytic, just unpacking definitions.
And they believed that all synthetic truths, the ones that add actual new information about the world, had to be a posteriori, meaning they had to come from empirical experience.
But Kant discovered a third category, a completely world-changing category, the synthetic a priori.
This is the category of knowledge that is strictly necessary and universal, yet it still adds brand new information to our understanding without relying on physical observation.
And to prove this category exists, Kant turns to mathematics.
Let's really slow down here because this is where the genius of this book really shines. Take a very simple arithmetic equation. 7 plus 5 equals 12.
At first glance, you might think this is just an analytic statement, just unpacking definitions.
But Kant asks us to look much closer. Take the pure concept of 7,
Yeah.
and the pure concept of 5,
Right.
and the concept of addition. You can analyze the idea of 7 and 5 merging together in your mind forever, but you will never find the number 12 somehow hidden inside them.
It's completely absent.
Yeah.
You actually have to step outside the pure concepts. You have to use your intuition.
Imagine you are holding 7 pebbles in one hand and 5 in the other. You have to physically or mentally synthesize the concepts together, counting step by step to arrive at the brand new concept of 12.
The judgment adds new information, making it synthetic.
Yet, it is not empirical. You don't need to continually experiment with physical objects to know it's true. It possesses absolute necessity and strict universality. 7 plus 5 equals 12 is true everywhere, always, without exception.
It is synthetic a priori.
He does the exact same thing with geometry. When we say a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, we are taking a purely qualitative concept, straightness, and we are combining it with a quantitative concept, the shortest distance.
Because straightness doesn't have a measurement hidden inside it,
Right.
we synthesize them purely in our minds.
This revelation establishes the grand problem that this entire book seeks to answer. Kant states it very clearly. How are synthetical judgments a priori possible?
Because if they aren't possible, then the entire field of metaphysics is a delusion.
Exactly. Metaphysics is built entirely on claims that try to add new knowledge about the universe without using physical experience. Claims like, the universe must have a beginning.
So if we can't explain how the human mind can generate valid synthetic a priori judgments, then philosophy is just a dead end.
And to illustrate the profound danger of ignoring this problem, Kant offers this hauntingly beautiful metaphor. Imagine a light dove soaring through the sky. As it flies, it feels the friction and resistance of the air pushing against its wings. It requires effort.
It's work.
In its mind, the dove might imagine that if it could just fly in a pure, frictionless vacuum, it could fly so much faster and freer.
But what the dove completely fails to realize is that the air resistance it fights against is the exact same thing that provides the lift to keep it aloft.
Without that thick, resistant air, the dove would instantly plummet to the ground.
Kant says this is exactly what Plato and dogmatic philosophers do. They look at the air of sensory experience and find it restrictive, messy, annoying.
So they abandon air.
They abandon it. They hope to fly higher into the pure frictionless void on pure ideas alone, only to find they have absolutely no support at all. Their grand systems just fall back to the earth.
To avoid the fate of the dove, Kant methodically organizes his investigation into our mental architecture. He wants to know exactly how the wings interact with the air. So he divides the critique into 2 main branches, the doctrine of elements and the doctrine of method.
And we begin our investigation in the doctrine of elements, specifically in a section he titles the Transcendental Aesthetic.
It's important to clarify the vocabulary here for you listening. The word aesthetic isn't about art or beauty in this context. It refers to the original Greek root for sensory perception.
In this section, Kant aims to isolate sensibility. He wants to see exactly what the mind contributes to our perception before thought even gets involved.
Think of your mind as a highly advanced digital camera. When you perceive any object in the world, Kant says there are 2 distinct elements at play. There is the matter of the phenomenon, and there is the form.
The matter is the raw light hitting the lens. It's the chaotic, unstructured sensation coming from the outside. The colors, the hardness, the physical resistance. This is entirely a posteriori. It comes from experience.
But the form is different. The form is the camera's internal software.
Right.
It is the invisible mental filing system inside your mind that instantly catches that raw, chaotic data, autofocuses it, color corrects it, and arranges it into a coherent image.
And that software, that formatting, must already exist in the camera a priori. It is ready and waiting before you ever press the shutter, before the sensation even arrives.
To find out what these pure a priori forms of intuition are, Kant performs a mental reduction. He asks us to strip away everything the active intellect thinks about an object, concepts like substance or force.
Then he asks us to strip away everything physical about the sensation itself, the color, the weight, the texture.
What are you left with? When all empirical data and all intellectual concepts are removed, what remains is pure intuition. And the very first of these pure mental forms that Kant isolates is space.
We normally think of space as a giant, empty container floating out there in the universe. Just a vast, dark room into which planets, stars, and people were placed.
But Kant fundamentally dismantles this view. He offers 4 precise, methodical arguments to prove that space is actually a property of your mind. Let's walk through them carefully because they build on each other in a remarkable way.
The first argument asserts that space is not an empirical concept learned from outside experience.
Think about it. In order for you to perceive an object as being outside of you, or to see that an apple is sitting next to a book, you must already possess the spatial framework to place them there.
You don't learn about space by looking at the distance between the apple and the book.
No, you can only see the distance because your mind already projected the framework of space to separate them. Space is the prerequisite for the experience, not the result of it.
Exactly. The second argument proves that space is a necessary a priori representation.
Close your eyes for a second. Try to imagine a space completely empty of objects. Wipe the universe completely clean in your mind. Take away the planets, the stars, the dust. It's relatively easy, right? You can picture an empty room. But now try to imagine the non-existence of space itself.
You can't.
You really can't. Even if you imagine absolute nothingness, it is a spatial nothingness. It has dimension in your mind.
Because it cannot be thought away, space is the necessary foundational condition for any phenomena to appear to us at all.
Kant's third argument is that space is a pure intuition, not a general concept. When we use a concept, like the concept of a tree, it applies to many different individual trees out in the world. But there are not multiple spaces in the universe.
There is only one single, infinitely all-embracing space.
If we talk about different spaces, like the space in your living room versus the space out in the garden, we're not talking about separate entities. We are merely drawing imaginary boundary lines within that one singular space. Because it is essentially one unified whole, it is an intuition, not a categorical concept.
And finally, the fourth argument. Space is represented as an infinite given quantity.
Right. A concept, by its very nature, cannot contain an infinite multitude of representations within itself. But all parts of space, no matter how small or how large we divide them, are equally capable of being extended into infinity.
The original representation of space must therefore be an a priori intuition given to us. It is a vast, endless canvas unrolled by the mind itself.
When you put these 4 arguments together, the reality we uncover fundamentally shifts how we understand our own existence. Space is not a void floating out in the dark universe. It is the invisible internal architecture of your own mind. It is a projector, casting a 3-dimensional grid outward, waiting to organize the incoming chaos of physical reality so that you can navigate it.
It really is a profound shift in perspective.
It changes everything. But it leaves us with an incredibly compelling question. If space is the silent, expansive stage our minds construct to place external objects upon, what happens when we close our eyes and look inward? If our outer world is organized by space, by what hidden, pure intuition does the mind sequence its own internal thoughts, its own memories, its very sense of existing?
We are opening Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason once again, just picking up the thread of this monumental book exactly where we left off.
Sitting here with this text in our quiet library, you can almost physically feel the weight of what Kant is attempting to achieve.
Yeah. It is a foundational philosophical book, one that fundamentally questions the absolute limits, the hidden structures, and the very capacities of human knowledge.
And our mission today, using the text here in front of us, is to conquer the middle section of Kant's framework, specifically the transcendental aesthetic and the beginnings of transcendental logic.
Right. We are looking at how the human mind doesn't just passively receive reality, but actively constructs it. So let us simply resume our hushed conversation. You sitting there listening are right here with us as we dive into what Kant calls the architecture of space and time.
And Kant makes a radical claim right out of the gate here. He argues that space is not an empirical concept derived from outward experiences.
Space is an a priori intuition.
Yes. It is a profound, almost dizzying shift in perspective. To truly grasp this, we have to completely let go of our everyday assumption that space is an objective container out there in the universe.
It's like a void that we just happen to walk around inside of.
Exactly. Kant argues that space is actually the necessary subjective condition, the formal capacity of the human mind to be affected by objects at all.
Okay.
Without this pre-existing innate framework of space already wired into our minds, we couldn't perceive anything as being outside of us, or alongside anything else in the first place. Imagine the mind permanently wearing a specific pair of tinted glasses through which all external reality must pass.
I need to challenge that immediately, though. Because that sounds completely counterintuitive to daily life.
It does.
If space is just a subjective framework, a condition in my head, What exactly is happening when I physically stub my toe
Hmm.
on a very real, very solid external wooden table?
Right.
I mean, I am interacting with physical space and distance in that moment,
Yeah.
and hurts.
That is the perfect question. And it is precisely why Kant introduces a crucial dual concept: empirical reality versus transcendental ideality.
Okay, unpack that.
When you stub your toe,
Yeah.
that table, the distance your foot traveled, the space it occupies, all of that is empirically real. For you, for me, for any human being bound by human senses, space is objectively valid for everything we can ever possibly experience.
Those real for us.
It is the absolute reality of our phenomenal world. But, and this is the transcendentally ideal part, if you remove the human subject, if you take away the biological river and their specific mental architecture, space is nothing.
Nothing at all.
It does not exist as a property of things in themselves.
Okay, I think I see the distinction. So instead of imagining we are walking around inside a giant universal fishbowl of space, it's more like the human mind is permanently running a specific geometric operating system.
That's a great way to look at it.
You can never uninstall it. Every single piece of external sensory data you will ever encounter must be compiled and rendered through this spatial software before your consciousness can even read it.
Exactly. We aren't seeing space out in the world. Space is the interface itself. It is the form of the external sense.
The operating system analogy captures the necessity of the framework perfectly.
It really does. And what is fascinating here is how Kant seamlessly transitions from this external framework to the internal one, time.
Right, time.
If space is the necessary form of the external sense, time is the form of the internal sense. Time is how the mind intuits itself and its own internal state.
Time is the bedrock of all our representations, internal and external.
Yes. And Kant details some absolutely certain apodeictic principles regarding time. For instance, time has only one dimension.
Just forward.
Furthermore, different times are always successive. They are never coexistent. You cannot have two different moments in time occurring simultaneously.
But hold on, we run into another massive intuitive roadblock here. A common objection, which I'm sure Kant faced constantly, is about the reality of change.
Oh, yes. The change objection.
If I look out the window of this library, I can watch a leaf fall from a branch to the ground. I can feel myself aging. Change is undeniably, absolutely real.
It is.
And logic dictates that change can only happen within time. Therefore, doesn't that prove that time must be an absolutely real, independent property of the universe, regardless of whether we are here to observe it?
It is a very natural reaction, and Kant anticipates it beautifully. He offers a very calm, rigorous refutation. He says, yes, you are entirely correct that change is real, but why?
Because of how we perceive it.
Because time is indeed the real form of our internal intuition.
Yeah.
Because we process reality through the lens of time, change is absolutely a real phenomenon for us. We experience it undeniably.
Right.
However, that does not suddenly elevate time to the status of a thing in itself, independent of our sensibility.
So we are back to the operating system. Time is just another fundamental line of code in the software processing the data.
Precisely. To illustrate this, Kant asks us to imagine a hypothetical entity with what he calls intellectual intuition.
Intellectual intuition.
Imagine a supreme being, an observer that does not rely on biological senses or human mental architecture to perceive reality. That being would not be bound by space and time.
They wouldn't have our tinted glasses.
Exactly. If that being observed the universe, they would not see change or succession or time at all. They would interact directly with the raw, unfiltered universe. They would see things in themselves.
Something so entirely different that human cognition cannot even fathom it.
We, however, only ever interact with phenomena things exactly as they appear to us through our permanent filters.
This establishes such a beautiful, rigorous limitation on human knowledge. It tells you exactly where the boundaries of your mind are drawn. And that boundary leads us directly into the next major section of our reading today, transcendental logic.
Yes, the transition from aesthetic to logic.
If the aesthetic we just discussed was about how we receive raw information through the interfaces of space and time, the logic is about how we actively think about that information. It is the marriage of intuition and conception.
Kant summarizes this necessary marriage with one of the most famous and foundational maxims in all of philosophy. He writes, "Thoughts without content are void. Intuitions without conceptions, blind."
Thoughts without content are void. Intuitions without conceptions, blind.
Knowledge fundamentally requires two distinct elements: The receptivity of the senses to gather the raw data, and the spontaneity of the understanding to actively organize that data.
Let's lean into our computer analogy again to unpack that maxim, because I think it helps clarify the abstract concepts.
Easier.
Intuitions, the sensory data filtered through space and time, are like raw, uncompiled source code. Conceptions, the thoughts and categories, the understanding, are the compiler, the organizing logic.
The blueprint and the materials.
Right. If you have the compiler but no source code, your thoughts are void. You're running an empty program that does nothing.
Void of content.
But if you have all the raw source code and no compiler to organize it, your intuitions are blind. You just have a chaotic screen of meaningless ones and zeros. Knowledge demands both.
Exactly. And to understand how this organizing compiler works, we have to clearly differentiate between general logic and transcendental logic.
Okay, let's break that down.
General logic is the classical logic you might study in an introductory philosophy or mathematics course. It completely abstracts all content. It doesn't care if you are making arguments about apples, celestial bodies, or abstract math. It only looks at the pure form of thought.
Its primary concern is ensuring you do not contradict yourself.
It is purely structural.
Right. General logic just says A cannot be both B and not B at the same time. It's the negative condition of truth.
Correct.
But transcendental logic, which is Kant's great groundbreaking project here, operates entirely differently, doesn't it?
It does. Transcendental logic does not abstract all content. Instead, it investigates the actual origin of our cognitions of objects. It specifically asks a staggering question. How is it possible that our pure conceptions, the rules inside our minds, can apply to objects a priori before we have even experienced them?
And Kant warns us heavily about confusing the two, specifically when it comes to the pursuit of truth. He asks the age-old question, what is truth?
The traditional definition is the accordance of a cognition with its object.
But Kant points out a dangerous trap here. General logic, as we said, is just a structural rule to prevent contradiction. But throughout history, philosophers have misused general logic as a magical tool to try and generate brand new objective knowledge about the universe out of thin air.
Kant calls this specific misuse the dialectic, a logic of illusion.
A logic of illusion.
It is when sophistry is used to make empty, structurally sound claims look like profound, objective truths about things we can never actually experience, like the nature of the soul or the origin of the universe.
Kant spends a massive portion of his book dismantling this illusion.
He does. But his focus for now is on the analytic. The analytic is the meticulous, careful dissection of our a priori knowledge into the fundamental elements of pure understanding. We are tearing down the engine to see exactly what parts make it run.
So let's open up the engine block and look at this analytic of conceptions. Kant explains that human cognition is discursive, not intuitive.
We don't possess that divine intellectual intuition we mentioned earlier.
Right. We don't just instantly know the absolute essence of a thing merely by gazing upon it. We know things by organizing them under concepts.
When you look at an oak out the window, you are actively applying the general concept of tree to the specific sensory data of brown and green.
Because we operate this way, Kant says the understanding is fundamentally a faculty of making judgments.
And to map out exactly how we make these judgments, Kant provides a meticulously structured table of judgments. He divides the logical functions of all human understanding into 4 distinct heads.
It is worth walking through them quietly and carefully, because this is the very architecture of human thought.
The first head is quantity. Under quantity, judgments can be universal, particular, or singular.
I found the singular judgment uniquely fascinating in his breakdown.
How so?
In standard pure logic, saying Socrates is mortal is treated identically to a universal judgment like all men are mortal, because there are no exceptions to the subject being discussed.
That's true. General logic doesn't distinguish them.
But in transcendental logic, Kant argues a singular judgment is distinct. It represents a specific unity standing against infinity. It is a vital, separate way the mind quantifies reality, zooming in on one indivisible point.
A very sharp observation. The second head he outlines is quality. Here, judgments are affirmative, negative, or infinite, and Kant's explanation of the infinite judgment is incredibly elegant.
It really is. He uses the example, the soul is not mortal.
Yes.
Now, at first glance, you might think that's just a standard negative judgment, but Kant says, no, it's infinite. Why? Because by stating the soul is not mortal, you haven't actually said a single thing about what the soul is. You have simply taken the concept of the soul and banished it somewhere out there into the infinite, boundless sphere of everything in the universe that isn't mortal. You've placed a boundary on the sphere of mortality, but you've left the rest of reality infinitely open and undefined.
It is completely different cognitive maneuver than simply affirming or denying a direct trait.
It's brilliant.
It shows the subtle geometry of how we carve up concepts. This leads into the third head, relation. How do concepts relate to one another in our judgments?
They could be categorical, hypothetical, or disjunctive.
I want to highlight the disjunctive judgment here. Think of it as establishing a closed system of mutually exclusive parts that together make up a complete, unified whole of a cognition.
Like a particle in a closed physics experiment. It must be in state A, state B, or state C.
Exactly. If I make the disjunctive judgment, the world exists either through blind chance, internal necessity, or an external cause, I am carving up the entire sphere of logical possibility into exclusive parts.
To remove a possibility from one part is to necessarily place it in another.
They operate in a shared community of logic. It is a sophisticated way the mind organizes possibilities.
Which brings us to the final fourth head, modality. This isn't about the content of the judgment, but rather the degree of certainty the mind attaches to it.
It can be problematical, which is just a stated possibility. Maybe something is true.
It can be assertorical, which is a stated reality. This is true right now.
Or it can be apodeictical, which is an absolute logical necessity. This must be true. It is impossible for it to be otherwise.
These four heads of judgment, quantity, quality, relation, and modality, are not just an arbitrary list Kant threw together. He claims they represent the exact, exhaustive blueprint of how the human mind thinks.
And Kant uses this precise blueprint as his map to discover the categories.
The categories are the pure, innate conceptions of the understanding. But before we list them, we must understand the prerequisite mechanism. Synthesis.
Synthesis is a word Kant uses relentlessly. He defines it as the act of joining different representations together to form a cohesive whole.
He has this beautiful, almost poetic description of the imagination. He calls it a blind but indispensable function of the soul.
It is the imagination that constantly performs this raw background synthesis of our chaotic sensory data. It weaves the disparate threads of color, shape, and time together.
And then the higher understanding steps in to strictly organize that woven synthesis into the pure concepts.
It is a two-step mechanical process of cognition. So what are these innate organizing concepts? What are the fundamental filing cabinets of the human mind?
Kant presents the complete table of the categories, and it maps flawlessly, one-to-one, to the four heads of judgment we just discussed.
First, corresponding to quantity, we have the pure categories of unity, plurality, and totality.
Second, mapping to quality, we have the categories of reality, negation, and limitation.
Third, mapping to relation, we have three profound categories. First, inherence and subsistence, which we generally refer to as substance and accident.
Second, causality and dependence, which is the famous concept of cause and effect.
And third, community, which is the reciprocity between an active agent and a passive patient.
And finally, fourth, mapping to modality, we have the categories of possibility and impossibility, existence and non-existence, and necessity and contingence.
Looking closely at this massive taxonomy, you can't help but notice the sheer obsessive architecture of Kant's mind.
There is a strict rule of threes happening here. In every single group, the third category is always the logical combination of the first two.
It is an incredibly elegant, almost mathematical system. Totality is simply plurality contemplated as a unity.
Limitation is reality combined with negation.
Furthermore, Kant divides these four main groups into two distinct camps. The first two groups, quantity and quality, he calls the mathematical categories.
This is because they deal purely with objects of intuition and their physical extent.
The second two groups, relation and modality, he calls the dynamical categories, because they deal with the actual existence of objects and how they dynamically interact with each other and with our understanding.
It is worth pausing here to address a historical philosophical dispute. Kant settles with this table. For centuries, the philosophers of antiquity, the scholastics, often talked about concepts like unity, truth, and perfection, as if they were transcendental, physical properties of the objects themselves.
As if a perfect sphere possessed a physical, glowing aura of perfection or truth.
Exactly. Kant gently but firmly corrects this historical error. He explains that unity, truth, and perfection are not properties of objects out in the empirical world. You cannot measure the truth of a rock.
These concepts are actually just logical criteria for the internal consistency of our own cognition. They are the rules for how our mind thinks, masquerading as objective properties of what we observe.
We project our internal logic onto the world.
So Kant has painstakingly mapped out the categories. He has given us the complete list of files. But here is the massive looming hurdle he has to jump over. And he knows it.
We can accept that we have these pure concepts inside our minds, like cause and effect. But what gives us the right to take a concept that lives purely inside human consciousness and aggressively apply it to the physical external objects out there in the universe?
Kant calls this justification the transcendental deduction. It is the most notoriously difficult and arguably the most important section of the book.
He uses a legal metaphor to frame the problem. Quid juris versus quid facti.
Quid facti is merely a question of empirical fact. How did we acquire this concept? You can trace the psychology of learning a word.
But quid juris is a question of legal right. What objectively justifies our legal right to use this concept to dictate the rules of reality?
The transcendental deduction is Kant's meticulous, exhaustive defense of our fundamental right to apply pure concepts to the real world.
And to build this defense, Kant first has to go on the offensive. He has to point out the ultimate, fatal inadequacy of relying purely on experience. He is specifically looking at previous empiricist philosophers here, particularly John Locke and David Hume.
Locke and Hume heavily pushed the idea that we derive absolutely all of our concepts from lived experience. We see things happen and we learn the rules.
But Kant says, no, that is a logical impossibility. You cannot derive a strict universal concept like cause and effect from mere messy experience.
Hume himself famously recognized this problem, but Kant provides the definitive answer. If you watch a billiard ball strike another over and over, experience only ever shows you a sequence.
It shows you that event B happens to follow event A.
But experience, no matter how many times you repeat the experiment, never ever shows you the strict, absolute, invisible necessity that B must follow A.
Experience is contingent. It tells you what is happening right now, but it can never guarantee what must happen universally across all time.
Exactly. Experience tells us what does happen, but it is utterly incapable of telling us what must happen.
Because we undeniably possess a concept of strict, universal necessity regarding cause and effect, that concept could not possibly have been pulled from observing the outside world.
It must have existed completely intact within the structure of the mind beforehand. The mind imposes the strict rule of cause and effect onto the universe. It does not learn it from the universe.
Which brings us to the zenith of the deduction. Perhaps the most profoundly important concept in this entire section of the philosophical architecture, the transcendental unity of apperception.
Or, expressed more simply, the persistent consciousness of the I think.
Kant explains to you, the reader, that the conscious thought, I think, must logically be capable of accompanying all of your representations.
If it didn't, if there was a disconnect, you would be processing complex sensory data that you couldn't even consciously claim as belonging to yourself.
It is a chilling thought. If the I think wasn't there, you would just be a biological machine receiving endless chaotic inputs without a central consciousness to anchor them.
When you hold a heavy book, trace the gold lettering on the spine, and smell the old paper, those are all entirely different, distinct streams of sensory data flowing into your brain.
But it is always definitively you experiencing them together as one unified object.
This unifying, singular self-consciousness, this persistent, quiet, I think, that hums steadily beneath every single experience you have ever had, is the ultimate, absolute foundation of all synthesis and all understanding.
The categories rely on judgments, judgments rely on synthesis, and synthesis fundamentally relies on the I think.
Without the, I think, actively and relentlessly weaving the raw data together moment by moment, the universe would not be a coherent reality. It would just be shattered, meaningless fragments of disconnected noise.
If we follow this thread, this revelation of the I think, all the way to its absolute logical limit, it leaves us staring over the edge of a rather unnerving precipice.
It really does.
If the very act of the, I think, synthesizing information is the sole engine that makes a coherent experience possible in the first place, does that mean the subjective self is nothing more than a mechanical process of compilation?
Is the self a pre-existing entity observing the world? Or is the self merely the ongoing, continuous act of organizing the chaos of the universe into the illusion of order?
And if the self is just a persistent engine organizing chaos into order, it begs a massive question regarding the future of our own technology. If we eventually build a machine, an artificial intelligence, that can flawlessly and continuously synthesize complex sensory data into pure concepts of understanding, just as Kant described.
Will that machine suddenly, undeniably wake up and possess its own, I think?
Well, look at the phenomena of the universe and recognize itself.
We are picking up the intellectual thread right where we left off in our ongoing journey through this really profound book.
Yes, stepping right back into the architecture.
Exactly. And if you are just joining us in this space, I want to gently welcome you back to our continuing exploration of the critique of pure reason. We're picking up the conversation in stride.
It is a monumental text,
Hmm.
and it requires a certain quiet focus to really walk through it.
It does. And I want to just softly remind you of the sheer scale of what we are doing here. This book is a massive investigation into the absolute limits and the capabilities of human thought. We are focusing entirely on how our mind actively constructs the reality we perceive.
Right, and the mission for this specific segment of our discussion is to explore the invisible machinery of human consciousness.
Specifically, how our mind unifies fragmented experiences into a single, coherent reality. We're going to unpack the precise rules the mind uses to build the physical world you see around you right now.
To start understanding that machinery, the author introduces a concept that sounds deceptively simple. He calls it the I think.
Yeah, I think.
Yes. Because if you strip away your assumptions, your empirical consciousness, your moment-to-moment perception is naturally fragmented. It is totally disunited. Think about what is happening to you at this exact second. You feel the pressure of the chair, you see the light, you hear a sound.
Right, it's just raw data. It's a chaotic storm of sensory input.
Exactly. And for any of that to make sense, there must be a foundational I that stitches it all together. The author calls this the original synthetical unity of apperception.
The original synthetical unity of apperception. Let me try to put an analogy to that. Imagine a film strip.
A film strip is a perfect way to visualize it.
If you just unroll a movie reel, you just have a chaotic pile of static, colored frames.
Yeah.
Without a single unified projector running them, you don't have a movie, I think, essentially that projector.
It is the projector, the light, and the mechanism all working as one. When the thought, these representations belong to me, occurs, what it really means is, I unite them in one self-consciousness.
Without that projector, my identity would just shatter with every new sensory input.
You would have a multicolored, fragmented self. Which is why this active unification is the absolute highest principle in all human cognition. But the book contrasts our human understanding with something quite fascinating to make the point clearer.
A hypothetical intuitive understanding, right? Like a divine mind.
Precisely. Our human understanding is discursive. We require raw sensory data, the film strip, to even have something to think about. But a divine, intuitive understanding wouldn't need senses. For that kind of mind, simply thinking about an object would actually bring that object into existence.
Wow, so its thoughts literally create the material reality.
Yes, whereas we only think. We cannot intuit things into reality. We have to look to our physical senses to gather the building materials.
Okay, so we gather the raw data. But then how do we actually make sense of it? The author gently shifts the conversation to the concept of judgment, which I think is our next step.
It is, and the author was actually quite dissatisfied with traditional logicians here.
Because they define judgment just as a relation between two concepts, right?
Right, which he found incredibly shallow. Instead, he argues that a judgment is the specific act of bringing given cognitions under the objective unity of apperception.
Objective unity. Let's use the book's specific example to ground this. The feeling of weight.
Yes, imagine holding an object. There's a subjective feeling. You might say, if I support a body, I feel an impression of weight.
Which is just about me in this exact moment. My arms feel heavy.
Entirely subjective. But if you make the objective judgment and say, the body is heavy, you are doing something mechanically different.
I am claiming that the properties are conjoined in the object itself.
Exactly. Universally. Regardless of the subject's current state, you are forcing raw data under an objective rule. And all sensuous intuitions are absolutely subject to these rules, which are the categories of the understanding.
The categories. They're the logical functions of judgment applied to raw sensory data. But the author adopts a very cautious, almost warning tone about these categories.
A very strict boundary is set. These categories only have meaning when they are applied to actual objects of experience.
It's fascinating to think about that in terms of pure mathematics. Mathematical concepts are pure, but they only become actual cognition when we apply them to empirical things in space and time.
Let's look at the concept of substance to see why this limit is so absolute.
Yeah.
We understand substance as permanence in time.
Like the underlying matter that stays the same even when it changes shape.
Right. But if you strip away the sensory experience of permanence in time, what happens to the category of substance?
It just becomes an empty word.
It is reduced to a mere logical ghost. It becomes a subject that cannot be a predicate, which tells us absolutely nothing about any real object in the universe.
Without sensory data, our categories are just completely empty forms of thought.
Which leads us to a seemingly contradictory, yet incredibly beautiful idea in the text: how the mind affects itself.
The transcendental synthesis of imagination. Or the figurative synthesis.
Yes, differentiating it from purely intellectual synthesis. Our understanding doesn't have its own intuition, so it must exercise its activity upon our internal sense.
The book uses such vivid examples for this. You cannot think of a geometric line without mentally drawing it in your head.
You physically have to trace it in your mind's eye. And you cannot think of time without drawing a straight line in your mind either.
Because time doesn't have a shape, so we borrow space to represent it internally.
And the profound consequence of this mental tracing is staggering. Because we have to process our internal thoughts through this time-structured filter, we do not know ourselves as we are in ourselves.
We only know ourselves as we appear to ourselves.
Exactly, through the filter of our internal sense.
Let's just sit with that for a second. I am a filtered phenomenon to my own consciousness.
It is quite a realization.
It really is. And it begs a grand, quiet question. How can these categories, which exist purely in our minds, dictate the laws of the physical world, the laws of nature?
It unravels a massive enigma. We have to remember that laws do not exist in the phenomena themselves, and phenomena do not exist as independent things in themselves.
Nature is just a complex of phenomena, mere representations in our minds.
Because all perceptions must pass through our mental machinery, the synthesis of apprehension and the categories. It is actually our understanding that prescribes the fundamental laws to nature.
It makes me think of a custom-tinted glass. The glass doesn't create the light, but it absolutely dictates the color of the light that passes through it.
A perfect analogy. Nature must regulate herself according to your mental framework.
Okay, so transitioning to the analytic of principles, the book brings up a highly relatable, very human element, the faculty of judgment as a talent.
Yes, the author defines understanding as the faculty of rules, while judgment is the ability to subsume objects under those rules, to know when a rule actually applies.
And this brings up the concept of mother wit.
Mother wit. You can teach someone rules all day long, but you cannot teach them judgment.
Right, a person might be an incredibly learned physician or a brilliant statesman on paper, but utterly fail in practice because they lack this natural gift.
And the author offers a really beautiful wry comparison here. He says examples are the go-kart of judgment.
The go-kart, which was like a baby walker or training wheels back then.
Training wheels for the mind. But he clarifies that transcendental philosophy is entirely unique. It actually does provide the specific conditions and rules for applying its own pure concepts.
But that creates a massive philosophical problem. Pure concepts like causality and sensory phenomena, like a falling apple, are completely different things. How do they ever connect?
This is where we introduce the transcendental schema as the crucial third thing.
The tertium quid.
Yes, it is pure, yet it has both intellectual and sensory qualities. And it can do this largely because it is rooted in time.
We should carefully distinguish a schema from a mere mental image, though.
Absolutely. No single image of a triangle can represent the universal concept of a triangle. An image is specific, acute, right? Obtuse. A schema is more like a monogram.
A rule for the imagination to generate an image. Let's methodically list the specific schemata for these categories just to see how this translation works.
For quantity, it is represented by number, which is the successive addition of homogeneous units.
And quality.
Quality is represented by reality versus negation, meaning the filling of time with a sensation versus empty time.
Relation.
Relation is represented by permanence for substance, succession under a rule for cause, and coexistence for community.
And finally, modality.
Modality is represented by possibility, which is existing at some time, actuality, which is existence in a determined time, and necessity, existence in all time.
So these schemata bridge the gap. And from there, the book takes us into a quiet, rigorous breakdown of the rules of thought, the supreme principles of judgments.
Starting with the supreme principle of analytical judgments, which is the principle of contradiction.
But there is a specific critique of the traditional phrasing of that principle.
Yes, traditional logicians phrased it as, it is impossible for a thing to be and not to be at the same time.
The phrase "at the same time" is the issue, right?
Exactly. The condition of time does not belong in pure logic. Take the example of an ignorant man. Can he become learned?
Yes, through study over time.
So adding time to a pure logical contradiction is a flaw. But that covers analytical judgments.
What about the supreme principle of synthetical judgments, where we are actually adding new information not contained in the original concept?
To connect two different concepts synthetically, we again need a tertium quid. A third thing. In this case, it is the internal sense and its a priori form, time.
This brings us to the visual architecture of the principles. It's described as a four-part system: the axioms of intuition, the anticipations of perception, the analogies of experience, and the postulates of empirical thought.
The first two, the axioms and the anticipations, are categorized as mathematical principles. They offer absolute, intuitive certainty.
Let's dive deeply into the axioms of intuition first. This principle states that all phenomena are extensive quantities,
Meaning the parts precede the whole. You have to draw a line point by point in your mind.
which proves why the mathematics of extension, like geometry, applies flawlessly to all objects of experience in the physical world.
It does. Though it is important to note that a formula like 7 plus 5 equals 12 is a numerical formula, not an axiom.
Because it is singular, there's only one way to add them, whereas axioms must be universal rules.
Precisely. Next, we softly unpack the anticipations of perception. This deals with intensive quantity.
Intensive quantity, meaning every reality, every physical sensation like the color red or the feeling of heat, has a degree.
Yes, and it can fade continuously down to zero, which is negation.
The implication of this continuity is completely fascinating for science. It completely destroys the need for scientists to invent the concept of empty space to explain why different materials have different weights or densities.
You don't need a void. A space can be completely, totally filled. Yet the degree of reality filling it can infinitely decrease without ever leaving an empty void.
The book uses the example of money to clarify this continuous quantity. $13 as a continuous value of silver versus 13 individual coins, which is an aggregate. Sensation is like the continuous value.
It is a profound way to view physical reality.
It is. And as we transition toward the third category of principles, the analogies of experience, I want to invite you to just ponder how you experience time.
We cannot physically see time.
We can't, yet we constantly, effortlessly arrange our realities into what is permanent, what succeeds something else, and what happens simultaneously.
If time itself cannot be perceived, then the only way we can possibly understand our existence is through the hidden, pre-installed rules of our own minds.
Forcing phenomena into these chronological relationships. We are the architects of our own sequence of reality, and that profound realization leaves us in a state of quiet reflection, perfectly suspended, as we prepare to step forward into the next phase of this exploration.
We are opening the pages of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Please know that this is the fourth part of a continuous 10-part exploration of this book.
Right, we are moving straight into some of its most profound philosophical waters today.
We are. Our quiet mission for this session is to calmly and methodically unpack the architecture of reality itself. We're looking at the analogies of experience, the postulates of empirical thought, his refutation of idealism, and finally, that crucial boundary between phenomena and noumena.
It is a lot to hold in your mind at once, but as we settle into these ideas, just allow yourself to let go of your everyday assumptions.
Yeah, the concepts we are about to discuss frame a central mystery, which is how your mind actively constructs the very fabric of what you consider real.
Exactly. It will fundamentally change how you perceive time, how you perceive reality, and really the silent operations of your own consciousness.
It requires a profound shift in perspective. Kant is, he's slowly dismantling the way we naturally assume the universe operates out there in the void.
He is, and he's rebuilding it entirely around the human mind. We are examining the invisible foundational rules that make your experience of the world possible in the first place.
Because without these rules functioning quietly in the background, your reality would just instantly collapse into a chaotic, unintelligible blur.
It would be static, just noise.
Right. So if we are going to understand how the brain builds reality, we have to start with time. And that brings us to the first analogy of experience, which is the principle of the permanence of substance.
The permanence of substance.
Yeah, the core argument here is that in all changes of phenomena, substance is permanent, and its total quantity and nature can neither be increased nor diminished.
Which, it sounds like a strict principle of physics.
It does, but it is actually about how we manage to perceive existence at all. The underlying question is if we need to experience time passing, how do we actually do that when time itself is invisible?
That is the pivotal problem Kant is wrestling with. You cannot look at time, you can't touch it, or hear time itself.
No, you can only see things changing in time.
Exactly. Because we cannot see time passing as an independent object, there have to be a permanent substratum, a solid, unchanging baseline within the objects we perceive.
A baseline that our minds can use.
Right. This permanent baseline is what allows your mind to understand that things are happening in succession one after another, or that they are coexisting at the same time.
You can think of it as a canvas.
A canvas is a great way to picture it. If the canvas itself were constantly vanishing and replacing itself entirely every fraction of a second, you would have no unified picture.
You just have flashes of nothingness.
You need something that abides, something that stays, so you can measure the chaotic flow of change against it.
There is a remarkably clear example in the text to ground this idea. A philosopher is asked a seemingly impossible question, which is, what is the weight of smoke?
I love this example.
This is beautiful. The philosopher answers by saying you simply subtract the weight of the remaining ashes from the weight of the burnt wood, and you have the weight of the smoke.
It illustrates perfectly that even in the destructive, completely chaotic act of a fire, matter itself does not perish.
Right, only its form undergoes a change.
From nothing comes nothing. Change is simply an alteration of traits. The philosophical term Kant uses is accidents.
But we shouldn't think of car crashes when we hear that word.
No, not at all. Accidents are simply the temporary states or the modes of existence of a thing. Think about a ceramic coffee mug.
Okay, a coffee mug.
You pour hot coffee into it, it becomes hot. You put it in the freezer, it becomes cold. The heat and the cold are the accidents. They change.
But the mug itself is the permanent substance.
Precisely. The substance remains untouched by the shifting states. If a thing absolutely began to be just popping into existence from pure nothingness, your mind would have no way to fix it in time.
Because an empty void of time is not something you can perceive.
Right. Permanence is the mandatory anchor for you to experience anything as a real object.
So if we have this permanent substance acting as our anchor, how do we make sense of things actually happening to it?
How do they connect?
Yeah, how do we string events together without them just being a random assortment of disconnected images? That leads directly into the second analogy, which moves from permanence to causality.
The rule here is that all changes take place according to the law of the connection of cause and effect.
But to really get this, we have to look closely at the difference between what happens in our imagination and what happens in objective reality.
There is a brilliant distinction made here between subjective succession and objective succession.
Let's unpack that quietly.
When you look at the world, your apprehension of things is always successive. Your mind takes in parts one by one. The vital question to ask is whether that sequence is just a choice made in your head or if it is dictated by the physical object itself.
Let's bring this into the modern day before looking at the classic examples from the book. Think about scrolling through a social media feed on your phone. You could look at a photo first, then read the text below it.
Right.
Or you can read the text first, then look at the photo. You can scroll up or you can scroll down. The order in which you perceive those elements is entirely subjective. It is arbitrary.
You have total freedom over the sequence.
Exactly. But contrast that with the battery on your phone dying. The battery reaches 1%, the screen goes black, and the phone powers off. You cannot perceive the phone powering off first, and then the battery dropping to 1% second.
The order of the dying battery is bound. It is forced. And the text illustrates this exact same concept using two distinct observations.
The house and the ship.
Yes. The first is looking at a large house. You can look at the roof first and let your eyes wander down to the foundation. Or you can look at the foundation first and slowly look up to the roof. That is your subjective freedom.
Just like the social media feed.
Right. But the contrasting observation is watching a ship floating down the stream of a river. You absolutely must perceive the ship higher up the river first and then perceive it lower down the river second.
You can't choose to see it downstream first, then upstream.
It is impossible to reverse this order in your apprehension of the event, unless time itself were moving backward.
So the ship on the river and the dying phone battery share a forced order, an unchangeable sequence. What the text reveals is that this forced sequence is governed by a rule, and that rule is causality.
Causality is the glue. The position of the ship upstream contains the condition that makes the ship's position downstream a necessary consequence.
It forces your mind to organize it that way.
Yes, this rule of cause and effect is what makes an experience objective. It is what distinguishes a real worldly event from a mere subjective play of your imagination or a dream.
If your mind didn't forcefully subject the sequence of phenomena to this strict law of causality.
You would just experience a chaotic, disjointed kaleidoscope of random images. Causality isn't just a habit we picked up from observing nature over time.
It's not just a pattern we noticed.
No, it is the fundamental, built-in rule your understanding uses to stitch moments together and make empirical truth possible.
And within this framework of causality, there is a fascinating nuance that challenges how we normally picture time. We usually imagine a cause happening first, a brief pause, and then the effect happening later, like a delayed reaction.
Like striking a match, and then it flares up.
Right. But the text points out that cause and effect can actually happen at the exact same time. They can be entirely simultaneous.
The order of time is what matters here, not the lapse of time. There are several gentle examples provided to illustrate this simultaneous causality.
Like the fire in a room.
Exactly. Think of a fire causing heat in a room. The fire and the heat exist at the exact same time. Or imagine a heavy leaden ball resting quietly on a soft cushion.
The ball is causing a hollow in the cushion.
But the ball and the hollow exist simultaneously.
Another example given in the text is a glass, causing water to rise in a concave shape at its edges. The glass drawing the water and the concave shape happen together in the very same moment.
Even if zero time elapses between the cause and the effect, the dynamical connection remains absolute. If you lay the lead ball down, the hollow follows. But if the cushion already have a hollow in it, a lead ball doesn't magically appear to fill it.
The direction of the cause is still there.
The cause still determines the effect, even if they share the exact same temporal space.
And as these changes occur, the text makes it clear that change is always continuous. There is no such thing as the smallest degree of time, nor the smallest degree of reality.
Meaning it doesn't just snap from one state to another.
Right. When a substance changes from state A to state B, it doesn't just instantly teleport from one reality to another across a void. It passes through an infinite number of intermediate degrees. Reality grows or diminishes through a continuous action. Nature makes no leaps.
That continuous, unbroken flow is vital to maintaining our sanity, really. If objects could simply skip frames of reality, our entire cognitive architecture would fail. We rely on that smooth, infinite gradation of change to understand our physical environment.
Which brings us to a broader view of that environment. Causality strings things together in a line, sequentially. But what about everything happening right now, all around you? The things existing together. Yeah, this is the third analogy. The principle of coexistence, or community. The principle states that all substances that can be perceived in space at the same time exist in a state of complete reciprocity.
We already established that time itself cannot be perceived. So how do you actually know two different things exist at the exact same moment?
How do you prove they are simultaneous?
The argument here is that we know things coexist because we can apprehend them in any order, back and forth. If there are objects A, B, C, and D in a room, you can look from A to D, or you can look from D to A.
Your perception can move reciprocally between them.
Exactly. The illustration used for this involves the cosmos. It looks at the Earth and the moon, and the light mediating between our eyes and those heavenly bodies.
Light produces a mediating community between us and the stars.
Without this reciprocal influence, this dynamic community where substances essentially interact with one another in space, every single perception would be completely isolated.
You would see one thing, the chain of experience would snap, and you would see another completely disconnected thing.
But instead, this universal community, this ongoing reciprocal action, is what ties all separate individual phenomena together into one unified, whole experience of nature.
Just look around the room you were in right now. The chair, the lamp, the window, the floor. They all coexist in a shared space, not because they're just sitting there independently in a void, but because your mind allows for reciprocal perception, binding them together into a single cohesive moment.
It is a totally interconnected web where nothing is truly isolated.
And having built this interconnected web, anchored by permanence, stitched together by causality and unified by coexistence, we reach the underlying mechanics that govern it all.
This brings us to what feels like the operating system of the human brain, the postulates of empirical thought.
These are the three postulates of modality: possibility, reality, and necessity. They sound like heavy philosophical categories, but they are deeply practical.
They are, and they do not add any new physical traits to an object. When you say something is possible, you aren't changing the concept of the thing itself.
Instead, These postulates describe how an object relates to your cognitive faculties. They describe how reality interfaces with your mind.
Let's walk through them quietly. First is possibility. Something is possible if it agrees with the formal conditions of experience.
And those formal conditions are simply the rules of space and time.
Yes, a triangle is possible not just because the idea of a three-sided figure lacks contradiction in your thoughts. It is possible because you can mentally construct it within the conditions of space.
It fits the framework.
If you try to invent a concept of a physical substance that exists in space but doesn't take up any room, or a human power to see the future without inferring it from the present, these are impossibilities. They violate the formal conditions of how human experience operates.
Second is reality. The postulate of reality requires that an object coheres with the material conditions of experience, which means sensation.
But it doesn't mean you have to see it right in front of your face.
Right. The example used in the book is magnetic matter.
We know magnetic matter is real, even if our physical human senses are too blunt and coarse to perceive the magnetism directly. We know it is real because we see it attract steel filings.
It's connected to our actual perceptions through those laws of causality we discussed earlier.
Exactly. If we can trace a continuous, unbroken empirical path from our direct sensation backward to the hidden object, that object possesses reality.
And the third postulate is necessity. Something is necessary if its coherence with the real is determined according to the universal conditions of causality.
We only know the existence of a thing to be necessary if it is the effect of a given cause. We can't say a substance itself is naturally necessary, only that its current state is necessary because it was caused by something else preceding it.
To summarize how these postulates govern nature, the text outlines 4 Latin principles. These are the unbreakable rules of our empirical world. Let's go through them. First, non datur casus.
Which means there is no blind chance in the world.
Second, non datur fatum.
There is no blind fate. All necessity is intelligible and conditioned by causes.
Third, non datur hiatus.
There are no gaps or voids in space that could break the unity of our experience.
And the fourth rule is non datur saltus. There are no leaps in nature. This is worth lingering on. Reality doesn't glitch.
It's that continuity again.
If you drop a book from your desk, it doesn't instantly teleport to the floor. It passes through every single millimeter of space between the desk and the floor. This isn't just a physical observation about gravity. It is a mandatory rule your brain enforces.
Your mind demands continuity.
If objects could leap through space or time without crossing the intermediate degrees, the cohesive fabric of your reality would completely unravel. You want to be able to trust a single perception.
These 4 principles are the sturdy floorboards of reality. Nothing is allowed into our conscious experience that would violate these rules.
But with the fabric of reality so firmly established as a product of our own internal understanding, a profound question arises about the external world. If all these rules are in our head, is the world outside just an illusion?
That brings us to a massive philosophical confrontation in the text. The refutation of idealism.
The target here is material idealism, specifically divided into 2 camps. There is the dogmatical idealism of Berkeley, who believed that space and all the objects in it were merely illusions or products of the imagination.
And then there is the problematical idealism of Descartes.
Descartes, who famously doubted the existence of everything in the physical world, finding certainty only in his own mind, his I am.
The defense deployed against these forms of idealism is incredibly elegant. It doesn't just dismiss Descartes, it turns his entire logic inside out.
It really does.
Descartes argued that our internal experience, the private flow of our own thoughts, is the only thing we can be immediately certain of, and that the external physical world is highly doubtful.
But Kant's counterargument proves that this internal experience, the very consciousness of your own existence in time, is actually only possible if there are real, permanent things existing outside of you in space. This requires careful unraveling. How exactly does the inner world of our thoughts rely entirely on the outer world of physical objects?
It goes all the way back to our starting point about time. To know that you exist in time, to experience your thoughts flowing one after another, you need a permanent background to measure that flow against.
You need the canvas.
Exactly. But your I, your pure abstract consciousness, does not contain anything permanent within itself to serve as that measuring stick. Your mind is always in a state of continual shifting flow.
Always processing new thoughts.
Yeah. Therefore, to be aware of your own changing state in time, you absolutely require the existence of external permanent matter in space. The internal world, which Descartes thought was the only absolute certainty, is entirely dependent on the immediate reality of the external world.
You cannot have the internal without the external.
It is a breathtaking reversal. The external world is secured by anchoring it directly to the very core of our self-awareness.
Having secured this world of experience, having built the rules of time, causality, and coexistence, we step back to look at the entire landscape of human cognition.
And the text uses a deeply evocative, quiet metaphor to describe this landscape.
It describes human understanding as an island of truth. This island is enclosed by nature within unchangeable limits, but surrounding this beautiful island is a wide, stormy ocean of illusion.
It is a sea filled with fog banks and melting icebergs.
Icebergs that deceive the mariner with vain hopes of new discoveries, constantly engaging him in dangerous adventures he can never complete.
It is a hauntingly beautiful image. This metaphor represents the absolute boundary of what humans can know. The island is the realm of phenomena.
These are things as they appear to us.
Yes, filtered through our physical senses and perfectly structured by our understanding, using those rules of causality, time, and space we just explored. This island is the only place where we can have real, solid, verifiable knowledge.
The stormy ocean, with its fog and melting ice, represents the realm of noumena, or things in themselves.
This is reality as it exists completely independent of human observation. It is the raw universe without our mental filters applied to it.
A very careful distinction is made regarding how we should view these noumena, dividing them into a negative and a positive sense.
We can only legitimately think of noumena in a negative sense.
Oh.
That means we use the concept merely as a boundary line
We stand on the shore of the island.
and say, my senses only go this far, and beyond them is a reality I simply cannot know. It is a vital limit to our sensibility.
But to think of noumena in a positive sense would mean we claim to actually know what those raw things in themselves are.
Exactly. And to do that, humans would require a completely different cognitive tool, something called intellectual intuition.
This would be a way of instantly knowing the true essence of a thing without using physical senses or the categories of human understanding.
But the text is resolute on this point. Human beings do not possess intellectual intuition. We are forever bound to the island.
The ultimate takeaway of this metaphor is deeply humbling. We cannot take our carefully constructed tools like cause and effect, or substance, or community, and apply them to things in themselves.
Those tools only function on the solid dirt of the island of experience.
If we try to cast our net of human causality out into the foggy ocean of the noumena, we will catch nothing but illusions and contradictions. It demands a profound intellectual modesty. We have to accept the limits of our island.
But within those limits, our knowledge is incredibly secure. To maintain that security, a brief but vital safeguard is introduced at the end of this section called the amphiboly of conceptions of reflection.
It is essentially a rule about cognitive hygiene. Before we can logically compare two ideas to see if they agree or conflict, we have to know exactly where those ideas originated.
This is the act of transcendental reflection. You must pause and ask, does this representation belong to my physical senses, or does it belong purely to my understanding?
If we mix them up, if we take a concept of pure understanding and treat it as if it were a physical object we can touch, we create an amphiboly.
An amphiboly is simply a confusion of boundaries. To accurately judge the truth of any thought, we must first perfectly trace its origin.
Without this reflection, we run the constant risk of mistaking the internal rules of our own mind for the external physical properties of the universe.
It is a quiet reminder to always examine the lens through which we are looking before we make bold claims about the landscape we see.
As we sit with these massive structural realities of the mind, from the necessity of a permanent anchor in time to the unyielding rules of causality to the limits of our island of truth, consider the implications for your own life.
Think about the space you are sitting in right now.
The colors you see, the time you feel passing, the sequence of events unfolding, none of that exists in that specific ordered way out there in the raw universe,
Your brain is actively rendering it for you in real time.
following a strict set of ancient invisible rules to keep you grounded. And it leaves us with a quiet, lingering question drawn from the depths of this exploration.
If our minds are entirely confined to this island of phenomena, perfectly designed by nature to understand the world only as it appears to us,
How much of our everyday human anxiety is wasted trying to navigate that foggy, unknowable ocean of things in themselves? How much peace might we find if we simply accepted the boundaries of our island,
which brings us right to the threshold of the fifth part of our journey together.
moving seamlessly into the next phase of the text where we We are continuing our quiet journey together through the pages of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. And uh, if you have been sitting with us, you know we are already deep into the architecture of the mind itself.
We really are.
We are just picking up the thread from our previous discussions, keeping our focus steadily on the book's core mission. And that mission is massive. It is mapping the exact limits of human thought and exploring with incredible precision what actually happens when the human mind tries to reach out and grasp things that exist far beyond the physical world.
Exactly.
Today we are going to explore how human reason naturally and almost inevitably deceives itself. We are going to examine the fascinating friction between our everyday understanding and pure reason, and we're going to look very closely at the fragile, perhaps illusory nature of the I, that constant sense of self that exists inside your head.
It is a profound stage of the journey. What is fascinating here is how Kant begins to systematically dismantle the ultimate confidence of the rational mind. He starts by diagnosing what you might call a centuries-old crime of human cognition.
A prime of cognition. I like that.
Yeah, he introduces a concept called amphiboly. An amphiboly, in this context, is a subtle, almost imperceptible confusion in the mind. It happens when we mistakenly mix up objects of pure thought with objects of the physical senses.
So we confuse what is in our head with what is actually out there.
Right, and to really grasp this, we have to look at the historical tension Kant highlights between two absolutely towering thinkers, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and John Locke. Kant observes that each of these men fundamentally misunderstood the nature of reality, but they did so in completely opposite directions.
Okay, so how did they get it wrong? Because these are, two of the smartest people in history.
They are, but their starting points were flawed. Leibniz intellectualized phenomena. He essentially treated the physical, tangible world as if it were made of pure thoughts, subject only to the rigid rules of logic.
He treated reality like a giant math problem.
Yeah. Yes. Locke, on the other hand, sensualized concepts. He reduced the pure, innate structures of the human understanding to mere habits that we pick up from sensory experience. Kant argues that to truly understand reality, we must recognize that our understanding and our sensibility are two entirely different sources of representation.
You can't just mash them together.
You simply cannot apply the rules of one directly to the other without falling into this amphiboly, this structural confusion.
I want to visualize this for you because Kant gives us some beautiful, concrete analogies to show exactly how our brains lie to us when we make this mistake. Let's look at the first one, which is about identity and difference. Imagine I am holding 2 drops of water.
Okay, 2 drops of water.
If I close my eyes and treat these 2 drops purely as concepts in my mind, if I abstract away all their physical qualities, their size, the way the light hits them, their shape, and I just think of the absolute pure concept of a drop of water with the exact same qualities, logic tells me they are completely identical.
Precisely. In the realm of pure thought, if there is no internal difference between 2 concepts, there's only one thing. The philosophical principle of the indiscernible says that if you cannot tell them apart conceptually, they are identical.
But as soon as I open my eyes and look at them as objects of sense existing right here in the physical world, their distinct physical locations in space prove they are 2 different things. Space itself guarantees their plurality. One is on the left, one is on the right.
Yes, the physical space matters.
Leibniz, by treating physical phenomena as pure thoughts, missed this entirely, didn't he? Because he was just treating reality like a math problem in his head, ignoring the physical canvas of space.
He did. And this leads us directly into the second analogy, which deals with agreement and opposition. Think of a simple math equation. 3 minus 3 equals 0.
Right.
In pure logic, realities do not contradict each other in a way that leaves nothing. Logical contradiction only happens when you affirm and deny the exact same thing simultaneously. You cannot say a triangle has 3 sides and a triangle does not have 3 sides.
Right, that just crashes the system entirely.
Exactly, that breaks logic. But the physical world does not play by pure logic alone. In the physical world, the world of phenomena realities can and do genuinely oppose and cancel each other out all the time.
Give me an example of that physical opposition.
Imagine 2 physical forces. 2 people pushing a heavy box in completely opposite directions with equal strength.
The box doesn't move?
The box does not move at all. But the forces are incredibly real. Their physical opposition results in 0 movement, but neither force is a logical contradiction of the other.
It's a real 0, not a logical 0.
Yes. Or consider internal human experiences, like the feeling of pleasure and a counterbalancing amount of pain. They are both profoundly real, but they oppose each other in your experience. You cannot understand this kind of physical or experiential opposition through pure logic alone.
This is where the detective work gets really fascinating. This mental confusion also fundamentally warps how we view what is internal and what is external, right?
It does. Pure logic demands that every substance must have an internal essence, something that exists entirely on its own, without relying on absolutely anything outside of it. Because Leibniz treated physical matter as pure thought, he concluded that all matter must be made up of simple, unextended internal substances. He called these monads.
Wait, let's define that because monad sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel. He basically thought the universe was made of these tiny, isolated, purely logical souls.
That is actually a great way to put it. He thought that if you strip away all the external stuff, all the physical relations, you find this purely internal, indivisible essence. But Kant points out that in the physical world of space, physical matter is entirely relational.
Relational meaning it only exists interacting with other things.
Right. To be physical matter is simply to exist in relation to other matter. A rock is entirely made of external forces pulling, like attraction, and pushing, like repulsion. There is no hidden, purely internal essence in a physical rock that you can find just by thinking about it in a dark room.
So a rock isn't a rock because of some secret inner soul. It's just a web of forces interacting.
Exactly. And furthermore, there is the whole issue of matter and form. Logic dictates that the matter, the raw conceptual material, must exist before you can give it form or structure. You need the clay before you can sculpt the statue.
That makes intuitive sense.
But human experience works backward. The form of our experience, which Kant identifies as the frameworks of space and time, must exist in our minds beforehand. We must have the grid of space and time active before we can experience the matter of physical sensations.
Our brain provides the canvas before the paint even hits it. So because we possess this framework of space and time, our minds are constantly at work, organizing and dividing reality. And it divides reality into what is possible and what is impossible.
Which is a huge task.
It is. Which leads us to one of the most intriguing and honestly bizarre sections of the book, The Table of Nothing. It sounds like a paradox. How do you categorize nothingness?
It does sound strange, but mapping out the concept of nothingness is crucial for Kant. He actually divides nothing into 4 specific logical categories. The first is an empty conception without an object.
Give me an example of that. What is an empty conception?
Imagine someone proposing a completely new, unseen, fundamental force in nature. Let's say a psychic energy that connects all human minds. It does not strictly contradict logic to think about it, but there is absolutely no physical proof or corresponding intuition in the physical world to back it up.
It's just an idea floating out there.
Right. It is an empty thought, a placeholder for something that isn't there.
Okay, so a thought without any proof. What is the second category?
The second is the empty object of a conception. This is essentially an absence or a deprivation.
Like cold being the absence of heat, or a shadow being the absence of light. The concept itself points to a lack of something real.
Spot on. Now, the third category pushes us further. It is an empty intuition without an object.
Let me guess, this is where it gets into that trippy territory with space and time.
Yes. Imagine the pure, bare framework of space and time, but completely empty. Imagine an infinite grid with absolutely no physical objects inside it. No planets, no dust, no light.
It's a void.
Exactly. It is the formal condition for reality to exist, but without any physical substance inside it, it is just nothing.
Wow. Just the empty stage with no actors. And the fourth category.
The fourth category is an empty object without a conception. This is a logical impossibility that contradicts its own definition. You cannot even imagine it. The classic example is trying to picture a geometric, completely enclosed two-dimensional figure made out of only 2 straight lines.
Like trying to imagine a square circle. The mind just crashes trying to render it because the concept annihilates itself.
Exactly. Understanding these categories of nothingness is vital because it prepares us to see how the mind manufactures its own illusions. But we have to draw a very careful line here regarding where errors actually happen in human cognition. Kant notes something that often surprises people. Our physical senses never actually make mistakes. The senses do not judge, they merely receive.
Wait, hold on. Kant says our senses never make mistakes.
Yeah.
But what about optical illusions?
It's a common objection.
Yeah, if I am driving on a hot summer day and I see a puddle of water on the road ahead of me, but as I get closer it vanishes because it was just a mirage, my eyes are definitely tricking me there, aren't they?
It feels that way, absolutely. But Kant would argue your eyes are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, processing the light waves that are being bent by the heat radiating off the asphalt. The hardware is working perfectly.
So where is the glitch?
The error occurs when your understanding steps in and makes a judgment about that data, deciding hastily that the shimmering light is a puddle of water rather than a trick of the heat. The error is in the software, the judgment, not the sensory reception.
Okay, so the eyes just hand over the data and the brain misinterprets it. That leads perfectly into this monumental concept in the book Transcendental Illusion. This isn't just a simple mistake in logic, right? If you make a math error or a logical fallacy, as soon as someone points out the correct rule, the illusion vanishes. You see the mistake, you correct it, and you move on.
Yes, logical errors are correctable.
But a transcendental illusion is different.
It is entirely different. A transcendental illusion is like a natural, unavoidable mirage of the mind itself.
The moon on the horizon is the best analogy for this. I want you to really think about this phenomenon. You stand on the beach and you look at the moon. Just as it is rising over the water, it looks absolutely massive.
Yeah, enormous.
Everyone has seen this.
Right.
Now, you can be an astronomer. You can know the exact mathematical distance of the moon. You can know its exact diameter. You know for an absolute fact that it is not physically larger on the horizon than it is high in the sky. But even knowing all of that math, you cannot force your human eyes to see it as normal. It is incredibly frustrating. The brain still sees it as huge.
That frustration is exactly the point Kant is making. The illusion persists even after the truth is known. Kant is saying that the human mind naturally and unavoidably creates these philosophical mirages. Our reason possesses this relentless, inherent drive to push beyond the safe boundaries of physical experience, and it constantly tricks us into applying earthly, physical rules to unearthly, unknowable things.
So why does the mind do this? Why are we wired to constantly trick ourselves?
To answer that, we must carefully distinguish between two faculties of the mind that we often lazily blend together: the understanding and reason.
Okay, let's break those down.
The understanding is our quiet, diligent rule maker. It is the faculty that processes our daily physical experiences, applying categories to the raw data of our senses to construct the stable reality we interact with. It is perfectly content working within the safe, verifiable boundaries of space and time.
It handles the everyday physics of life.
Exactly. Pure reason, however, is a completely different animal. It is a restless, soaring faculty. It is never satisfied with just knowing how something happens in a chain of cause and effect. It demands to know the ultimate principle behind it all. It constantly seeks the absolute, unconditioned, the final answer that requires no further explanation.
This restless search for the ultimate answer, this brings us right to Plato, doesn't it? Plato gave us the concept of ideas, these perfect, ultimate forms, like the perfect republic or the ultimate, uncorrupted concept of virtue.
Yes, and Kant has a brilliant, very nuanced take on Plato here. Kant argues that Plato was absolutely right when it came to morals and ethics. In the realm of human action, we desperately need the idea of perfect virtue.
Because it serves as an archetype. We have to measure ourselves against something perfect, an internal standard, even if we are flawed, and no human being will ever actually achieve perfect virtue. It gives us a direction to walk in.
Exactly. The idea is necessary for moral progress. However, Kant argues that Plato made a fatal philosophical error when he took these absolute ideas and tried to apply them to physical nature. Trying to find the absolute, perfect, unconditioned source of the physical universe leads to massive philosophical dead ends and contradictions.
Yet, despite knowing about those dead ends, Kant says our reason inevitably produces three specific transcendental ideas in its desperate, restless search for completeness. It just cannot help itself.
The mind demands them.
It does. The first is psychological, the search for the absolute unity of the thinking subject, which we call the soul. The second is cosmological, the search for the absolute unity of all conditions in the physical universe, which we call the world. And the third is theological, the search for the absolute unity of all objects of thought, the condition of all possibility, which we call God.
We need to focus deeply on that first transcendental idea, the soul. Kant dedicates a significant, heavy portion of this text to dismantling the rational psychology of his day, the attempts by philosophers to prove the soul's existence and immortality through pure logic alone. And what is staggering is that he shows how the entire structure of this grand illusion rests on a single, seemingly innocent grammatical phrase.
The phrase, I want you to just pause and think about the voice in your head right now processing these words. That constant, unbroken I that narrates your life from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep.
Yeah.
Kant says this phrase, is actually just a mere logical vehicle.
It is. It is an empty form. Kant argues that the I think must be capable of accompanying all our distinct thoughts so that they can belong to a single unified consciousness, Otherwise, you would have a fractured stream of disconnected experiences.
So it's the glue. It's the structural necessity that holds the sentence of our consciousness together.
Exactly. But here's the trap. Here is the paralogism, which is Kant's term for a structural, unavoidable illusion of pure reason.
A parallel.
Right. We take this formal, empty, unifying I, this logical glue that connects our thoughts, and we falsely convince ourselves that it is a permanent, immortal, physical substance.
We turn grammar into magic.
We literally look at the grammar of our own thoughts. And because every thought requires an I as the subject of the sentence, we leap to the massive metaphysical conclusion that this I is a simple, identical entity that exists continuously over time, completely independent of our physical bodies. We confuse the logical unity of consciousness with the real substantive unity of a soul.
Let me make sure I'm getting the weight of this. We build an entire metaphysical castle on a trick of grammar. We say to ourselves, I think, therefore I am a simple substance. We assume that because the I cannot be broken down into parts in a sentence, it must be an indestructible thing in reality.
Precisely. You nailed it. And Kant specifically targets the arguments of other philosophers who try to prove the soul's immortality using exactly this flawed logic. He brings up a very famous proof by the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn.
Walk us through Mendelssohn's proof.
Mendelssohn argued that because the soul is simple, meaning it has no physical parts, no left or right, no top or bottom, it cannot be broken apart or dissolved like a physical human body. Since it cannot be decomposed or shattered into pieces, Mendelssohn concluded it must be immortal. It cannot simply cease to exist.
Which makes sense on the surface. If you can't smash it into pieces, it can't die. But Kant systematically dissects this proof, doesn't he?
He does, with a truly brilliant counterargument. He introduces a concept called intensive quantity.
Wait, Kant actually uses a specific term for this, right? A languescence, which is a beautiful, almost haunting word. It basically means the state of fading away.
It is a striking word. Think of a musical note played in a quiet room, let's say a single sustained piano key.
That note doesn't have physical parts. I can't chop a C-sharp in half with an axe. But it has a degree of intensity. And over time, as it rings out in the room, it slowly fades. It languishes into silence.
That is the perfect metaphor. Or think of a light slowly dimming into total darkness. Kant argues that even if we grant Mendelssohn's premise, even if we agree that the soul or consciousness lacks physical pieces that can be scattered, consciousness itself still has a degree, it has an intensive quantity. Therefore, just like that fading musical note, consciousness could gradually fade to absolute zero.
It doesn't need to shatter, it can just diminish until it is gone.
Exactly. Because of this entirely logical possibility, Mendelssohn's proof fails. The immortality of the soul cannot be proven by pure reason alone, because pure reason simply cannot rule out the gradual fading away of consciousness.
I want you to sit with that realization for a moment. Really feel the weight of it. Think about your very sense of self, that constant narrator behind your eyes. Kant is suggesting that this feeling of permanence might just be a mirage. It might simply be a structural illusion created by your mind's necessary need to organize its thoughts into a coherent stream, rather than actual proof of a permanent, unbreakable, immortal substance hiding inside you.
It is a humbling thought, but it leads us to an even larger problem. If our reason tricks us so profoundly when we look inward, trying to grasp the nature of our own souls.
What happens when this same restless, unyielding reason tries to look outward, attempting to measure the absolute edges of the universe at the very beginning of time itself?
You are standing right now in the quiet, vast architecture of your own mind.
Just take a moment to really feel that.
Yeah. If you listen closely, you can almost observe your thoughts, organizing the very world around you, constructing space, measuring time, building what you call reality out of the raw, chaotic data of your senses.
We are stepping into the sixth threshold of our journey through this book, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
It's a monumental map of human reason. We are trying to discover exactly what the mind can know through its own lived experience, and precisely where it gets lost when it tries to grasp things beyond the physical world.
And we are at a fascinating frontier right now. It's a point where reason attempts to understand the soul and then almost immediately tries to comprehend the entirety of the universe.
Which is a borderland where human thought reaches its absolute limit. It just tangles itself in unavoidable illusions.
Let's start with the internal world, the realm of rational psychology. The book introduces this concept simply called the I think.
Right, the I think. And what is so compelling about this phrase is that, well, while I think proves we exist as thinking beings, it's strictly an empirical proposition.
Exactly. It relies entirely on our lived experience and time. We experience ourselves thinking in this exact fleeting moment.
It is not some a priori truth. It isn't a fundamental universal blueprint known completely independent of experience like a math equation. Because it's merely empirical, it doesn't give us an x-ray into what the soul actually is.
We feel this distinct unity of consciousness. You experience yourself as a single unified self. But the book demonstrates why our two primary attempts to define this self completely fail.
Materialism and spiritualism.
Right. Materialism tries to reduce the mind purely to physical matter. It basically argues that consciousness is just, the clicking of biological gears.
Flesh and electricity.
Yes. And spiritualism, on the other hand, imagines the mind as an ethereal, independent ghost floating entirely free of the physical form. Both of these are illusions, because they attempt to study the observer as if it were just another object in the room.
If we think about this practically, it is like trying to use a camera to take a photograph of its own internal mechanisms.
It's a perfect way to look at it.
The unity of consciousness acts as the lens that allows us to experience the world. But we cannot detach that lens, flip it around, and observe the soul as a standalone object.
Which means rational psychology doesn't give us new, transcendent knowledge about our inner selves. We don't get them out of the spirit.
No. Instead, this field of thought acts as a discipline. It sets up strict, impassable boundaries.
It acts as a guardrail. It prevents our reason from collapsing into a purely mechanical, soulless materialism, and simultaneously stops us from drifting into the foggy, untethered mazes of baseless spiritualism.
And just as the mind created this one-sided illusion about the nature of the soul, what the book calls a paralogism, it is about to face a much more intense conflict.
A massive one.
We shift our focus here from the internal world of the self to the external physical universe, the cosmos. If the soul presented an illusion of internal unity, the cosmos presents an illusion of external totality.
The book describes this transition as stepping onto a dark battlefield of ideas. And the victor on this battlefield is simply whoever is permitted to attack last.
This is the realm of the antinomies.
Yes. It is the space where reason falls into severe, structural self-contradiction. And the real tragedy of this battlefield is that reason doesn't fall into these contradictions through flawed logic or, cheap argumentative tricks.
It falls into them naturally, unavoidably, simply by obeying its own fundamental rules.
To understand this battlefield, we have to use what Kant calls the skeptical method. And we must distinguish this entirely from pure skepticism.
Because pure skepticism is just destructive. It tears down belief and leaves you in ignorance.
Right. The skeptical method is constructive. Imagine a wise, silent judge watching two brilliant lawyers argue a case to absolute exhaustion.
By letting these dogmatic assertions clash freely, we aren't trying to pick a winner.
No, we just watch the argument. We watch to discover the hidden misunderstanding, the flawed fundamental assumption that caused the fight to break out in the first place.
And the root of this conflict is reason's fundamental aversion to mystery. Reason hates a mystery. It demands what the book calls the unconditioned.
If reason observes a condition like an event happening or an object existing, it demands to know the prior condition that caused it.
And then it seeks the condition before that, and it steps backward continuously until it reaches an absolute beginning, a final totality.
It searches for an unconditioned resting place where the questioning can finally stop.
We can differentiate how reason searches for this by looking at progressive versus regressive synthesis.
Let's use an analogy for this. Progressive synthesis is like wondering about the endless future descendants of a family line.
Right. Reason doesn't actually need to know the ultimate end of that future line to understand the family as it exists today. It's an optional, forward-looking exercise.
But regressive synthesis is like tracing a person's ancestry. To fully explain the person standing in front of you, reason feels immense pressure to find their parents and their grandparents, tracing all the way back to an absolute origin.
Reason feels it absolutely must find the origin to make sense of the present condition. And this need to trace things backward drives reason into four specific cosmological ideas.
The first is the completeness of composition. That deals with time and space.
The second is the completeness of division, dealing with matter and its internal parts.
The third is the completeness of origination, which covers causes and freedom.
And the fourth is the completeness of dependence, examining the contingency of things and the necessity of a supreme being.
These four categories generate the four antinomies, the ultimate clashes of human thought. Let's really take our time and walk through these.
We'll start with the first conflict, the battle over time and space. The lawyer for the thesis steps forward. He argues that the world has a beginning in time and it has strict limits in space.
And the logic here relies on the nature of infinity. Just imagine time as a continuous series of moments. If the world had no beginning, then up to this exact present moment, an infinite amount of time must have elapsed.
But the definition of a true mathematical infinity is that it can never be completed by merely adding one unit to the next. You cannot reach the end of an infinite timeline.
Exactly. If the past were genuinely infinite, we could never have traversed it to arrive at right now.
Yet right now exists, you are experiencing it.
Therefore, an infinite past is a logical impossibility. The world must have had a precise beginning. And by the exact same logic, an infinite physical space cannot be comprehended as a whole by the mind, meaning the universe must be enclosed in finite spatial boundaries.
The logic is sound, it feels solid, but the lawyer for the antithesis counters with an equally devastating proof.
The antithesis states that the world has no beginning and no limits in space. It is infinite in both directions.
Let us assume the thesis is correct for a moment. Assume the world did have a beginning. That implies there was a time before the world existed, an absolute empty void time.
But in a pure void, there is no distinguishing feature. There is no prior condition that could possibly trigger anything to pop into existence, rather than just remain nothing.
Nothing can originate from an absolute void, because a void lacks the causality to initiate an event.
Therefore, the world could not have simply begun. It must stretch infinitely into the past.
And furthermore, if the physical world has a limit in space, it must be floating inside an infinite empty void. But a relationship between physical matter and pure nothingness is an absurdity.
Physical boundaries can only exist between things, not between a thing and non-existence. Thus, the world must be infinite.
So you are trapped. If you argue for a beginning, you are trapped by the impossibility of something springing from an empty void. If you argue for infinity, you are trapped by the impossibility of completing an infinite sequence to reach the present day.
Reason is deadlocked.
And from the vast expanse of time and space, reason naturally turns its gaze inward toward the microscopic. This is the second conflict, matter and the simple.
The thesis argues that everything composite in the world is made of simple, indivisible parts. We might call these fundamental monads, units of reality that absolutely cannot be cut or divided any further.
If you conceptually strip away how things are put together, if you dissolve all composition in your mind, something fundamental must remain.
If there are no indivisible parts left over, then absolutely nothing remains. And if nothing remains, the composite thing could never have existed in the first place.
To have any physical reality at all, there must be a foundation of absolutely solid, simple parts.
But the antithesis responds that there are no simple parts. Everything is infinitely divisible, and the proof relies on the geometric nature of space itself.
Everything that physically exists occupies space. Space, by its very mathematical definition, is infinitely divisible. You can take any area and cut it in half, endlessly.
Therefore, whatever real physical substance fills that space must also be just as divisible as the space it occupies.
If a fundamental monad or atom takes up space, it inherently possesses a left side and a right side?
Because it has sides, it is not simple. It is composite, and it can be divided. Reality, therefore, is an endless fractal of division, with no solid floor to stand upon.
If we accept the thesis, we must imagine a physical object that somehow takes up no space, which defies physics. If we accept the antithesis, we must accept that reality is built out of things that can be infinitely dissolved, meaning nothing is fundamentally solid.
The judge remains silent, and we move to the third conflict, the war between freedom and nature.
The thesis argues that there must be a causality of freedom, a spontaneous, uncaused first cause, existing alongside the deterministic laws of nature.
If every event in the universe strictly requires a prior cause, then there is never a complete chain of events. The causal chain stretches back infinitely, meaning there is never a true origin for anything that happens.
To make sense of the sequence, there must have been a spontaneous spark of freedom that initiated the chain. The book uses the example of getting up from a chair.
When you freely chose to stand up, you are initiating a completely new chain of physical events in the universe that was not strictly predetermined by the previous state of the cosmos. You act as an absolute beginning.
But the antithesis dismantles this by defending the unyielding laws of nature. There is no freedom, it argues. Everything is strictly bound by determinism.
If true transcendental freedom existed, meaning an event could just pop into existence without a prior physical state causing it, it would destroy the fundamental fabric of reality.
Scientific observation and the unity of experience rely entirely on the fact that every event follows a universal rule.
If spontaneous, uncaused actions could erupt into the physical world at any given moment, the orderly sequence of time would shatter. Rules would no longer apply universally.
We would be left in a lawless chaos, where coherent experience and scientific inquiry are completely impossible.
So we are torn between the necessity of a first cause to complete the chain and the necessity of strict rules to make reality observable.
Which leads us directly to the fourth conflict, the necessary being.
The thesis argues that an absolutely necessary being exists, either as part of the world or as the cause of it.
This argument looks at the endless chain of contingent things. A contingent thing is something that exists, but did not strictly have to exist. Its existence depends on something else.
A tree is contingent on a seed, which is contingent on soil, and so on.
This fragile chain of dependent events requires a solid, necessary, unconditioned foundation to hang upon. Without a necessary being, something that must exist by its very nature, to anchor it, the entire series of contingent events would have no ultimate reason to exist at all.
The antithesis systematically rejects this. There is no absolutely necessary being anywhere, neither within the world nor outside it.
If this necessary being exists inside the world, it exists within time. And anything that exists within time is just another link in the causal chain, meaning it requires a prior cause, which instantly renders it contingent, not necessary.
If we argue that it exists outside the world, entirely beyond time, it faces a different paradox. To act as a cause for the world, this being would have to act. It would have to begin a sequence of events.
But the very concept of beginning an action requires entering into time. It would have to step into the temporal world of phenomena to cause an effect, tying it inextricably back to the very chain of dependent events it was supposed to transcend.
The book illustrates this deadlock with a brilliant analogy of two astronomers arguing over whether the moon rotates on its axis.
One astronomer says it does rotate because it always shows the exact same face to the Earth as it orbits.
The other astronomer says it absolutely does not rotate, citing the exact same observation, that it always shows the same face to the Earth.
By operating from two different standpoints and using two different frames of reference, they both reach perfectly logical yet entirely contradictory conclusions.
Which brings us to analyze why human beings passionately align themselves with one side of these unwinnable wars over the other.
The book attributes this to the underlying interests of reason. It divides these interests into dogmatism on the side of the thesis and empiricism on the side of the antithesis.
The side of the thesis, which aligns with Platonic thought, is immensely popular because it provides the common human understanding with warmth and comfort.
It grants us a definitive beginning to the universe, the dignity of free will, an immortal soul, and the architectural assurance of a supreme being.
It serves our highest practical, moral, and religious interests. It makes the universe feel purposeful and manageable.
The side of the antithesis, aligning with Epicureanism and empiricism, holds undeniable power for scientific inquiry. It allows the human understanding to investigate nature endlessly.
It never halts its research to rely on an unobservable concept, like a spontaneous soul or an invisible first cause. It demands evidence and observable rules.
But there is a distinct danger when empiricism becomes dogmatic. If it aggressively claims there is absolutely nothing beyond what can be physically measured, it risks crushing morality.
It strips away the practical foundations for human freedom, leaving us in a purely mechanical universe where our actions are nothing more than the inevitable grinding of physical clockwork.
We find ourselves suspended between the moral comfort of the thesis and the scientific endlessness of the antithesis. But reason cannot simply abandon the field.
Reason cannot blame the physical universe for these contradictions, because the physical universe did not pose the questions.
Reason itself invented the concepts of absolute beginnings and infinite spaces. These antinomies are traps built into our own cognitive architecture.
Because reason generated the conflict, reason bears the inescapable responsibility to resolve it.
The resolution begins with a profound realization. The cosmological ideas that the demands for infinite pasts or absolute origins are always either too large or too small for our actual empirical experience.
The book clarifies this with a highly specific analogy. Imagine a man trying on a coat. If the garment does not fit, we do not say the man is too long for the coat.
We say the coat is too short for the man.
In this framework, the standard of truth, the man, is our possible lived experience. The absolute ideas generated by reason are the code.
These ideas create contradictions because they simply do not fit our experience. If we assert that the universe is infinite, that concept is too large for our finite experience to ever physically verify or grasp.
If we assert it has a definitive beginning, that concept is too small, because our empirical experience always demands to know the prior condition that came before it.
If the ideas do not fit the reality of our experience, we must uncover the fundamental illusion that the judge has been waiting to reveal.
The illusion driving both the thesis and the antithesis is that we have been treating space, time, and the physical phenomena of the world as if they are things in themselves.
We have treated them as independent objects that exist out there in the dark, entirely separate from our observation of them.
Transcendental idealism provides the key to dismantling the illusion. It concludes that space and time are merely the lenses through which human consciousness views reality.
They are our representations. Think of them as the operating software our mind uses to process and organize the raw, unknowable data of the universe.
They are not independent physical containers floating out in the void. Because space and time are strictly the forms of our own intuition, the question of whether the physical universe is infinite or finite in space and time is fundamentally meaningless.
It is attempting to measure a concept using a tool that only exists within your own mind.
Consider the implications of this.
The physical universe you observe, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the time you feel passing, the vast endlessness of the night sky, none of this is the reality of the thing in itself.
It is the spectacular, unified projection of your own mind's architecture.
The physical world is simply how your consciousness translates an entirely unknowable reality into a structured format you can navigate.
If time and space are merely your mind's internal mechanism for organizing data, then your anxieties about the passage of time or the physical boundaries of your existence are bound to an interface, a rendering of a reality you can never directly touch.
As we observe the solid ground of space and time dissolving into the structural frameworks of our own perception, we recognize that the map we have been carefully tracing has led us to the absolute edge of the observable world.
The illusions of the cosmos are exposed not as flaws in the universe, but as the inevitable, overreaching architecture of human reason itself.
And as the theater projection of space and time flickers, revealing the blank, impenetrable reality behind it, the mind is drawn continuously forward, stepping deeper into the dark, uncharted territory of what remains unmapped. We are returning to the quiet, complex architecture of Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason.
Yes.
And if you have been following along, you know we are currently navigating the 7th segment of a 10-part continuous journey through this monumental book.
It's a profound space we're entering now.
It really is. Our mission for this segment is to unpack what is called the critical solution to the cosmological problem. We're going to explore how human reason naturally, almost inevitably, tricks itself into contradictions. We will examine the intense, quiet battle between the laws of nature and human freedom, and we'll look at exactly why the human mind inevitably tries to construct the idea of a supreme being.
It is a remarkable section of the book, mainly because it addresses the very limits of how you and I can even think. It begins by exposing a fundamental illusion.
Right, a trap.
Exactly, a trap that our minds fall into by their very design. This is the core fallacy of the cosmological problem, and it's something that trips up almost everyone who tries to think about the universe as a whole.
I was struck by this trap, actually, because it operates on a piece of logic that feels undeniably true when you first hear it.
Yeah, it really does.
It goes like this. If a conditioned thing exists, then the entire series of its conditions must also exist.
Right.
So to put that in everyday terms for you listening, if you're holding a physical object or witnessing an event, that thing is conditioned by something that came before it.
Exactly.
And common sense tells us that if this final object is right here in your hands, the entire historical chain of causes that led to it must also exist, complete and whole, out there in the universe. But the book says this is a complete fallacy. Why is this logic so dangerous?
It's dangerous because it mixes up two entirely different ways of existing. The book explains that this statement is perfectly true if we're talking about what it calls things in themselves.
Things in themselves.
Right. A thing in itself is an object that exists completely independent of your perception, independent of time. It's given all at once in a realm we cannot actually access. If the universe were a static thing in itself, then yes, all its conditions would exist simultaneously.
But that's not how we experience the universe.
No, not at all. That logic completely fails when we apply it to phenomena. And phenomena are the objects of our senses, the actual physical things and events you experience every day.
So because phenomena are bound by time, the rules change entirely.
Exactly.
You experience the world moment by moment, piece by piece, like watching a film frame by frame. You are saying we cannot assume that an absolute completed totality of conditions, like a fully finished reel of film, exists out there for things that we can only ever experience successively in time.
That is the exact core of the issue. The human mind naturally treats the phenomena it sees as if they were things in themselves, existing outside of time. We take a logical rule that is meant for a timeless, perfect reality, and we incorrectly force it onto our time-bound physical world.
We assume the universe is a completed container of events.
Right, rather than a continuous unfolding of experience.
This actually naturally leads into a fascinating historical defense in the text. It brings up Zeno of Elea.
Oh, yes.
Now, Plato severely criticized Zeno. He essentially called him a sophist, a philosophical trickster, because Zeno would argue both sides of a contradiction. For example, Zeno would argue that the universe is neither in motion nor at rest.
Which, on the surface, sounds like absurd wordplay.
It does, but the book actually steps in to vindicate Zeno here. How does it rescue his reputation?
It vindicates him by introducing a very grounded, relatable distinction about the nature of opposition. We often think that in any argument, one side must be true and the other must be false.
Right, a binary.
But the book clarifies that there are two types of opposition: analytical and dialectical. To explain dialectical opposition, it uses a brilliant, simple analogy about a smelling body.
I love the smelling body analogy. Let's walk through that because it totally shifted how I view these grand philosophical debates.
Okay, so imagine you are presented with a physical body, and someone says, this body has either a good smell or a bad smell. Your instinct is to think one of those must be true.
Right.
But actually, both statements can be entirely false. Why? Because the body might have no smell at all. A rock, for instance, might be completely odorless.
Ah, okay.
This is a dialectical opposition. You assumed an underlying condition that the body possesses the property of smell in the first place, which simply wasn't there.
But if we change the phrasing just slightly, it becomes an analytical opposition. If I say a body is either good smelling or not good smelling, then one of those absolutely must be true, because a rock is not good smelling.
Precisely. Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we can apply this exact logic to the universe itself. For centuries, philosophers have argued the world is infinite versus the world is finite.
And they fight bitterly over which one is true.
They do. But the text reveals that they are making a massive hidden assumption, just like assuming the rock has a smell. They are assuming the world is a complete thing in itself that can be measured as a whole.
So because the world is only a series of phenomena that you observe successively in experience, it is neither an infinite whole nor a finite whole in itself. Both statements are false.
Yes.
The universe isn't a pre-existing container waiting to be measured. Its size is only realized through your continuous act of measuring it.
Both sides of the argument are false because the subject they are arguing about, the universe as a completed, measurable totality, simply does not exist in the way they think it does.
If human reason is trapped like this, constantly building paradoxes because it misunderstands the nature of the universe, how do we move forward? Doesn't this paralyze science and philosophy?
It would if we didn't redefine what reason is supposed to be doing. The book resolves this gridlock by stripping pure reason of its constitutive power.
Constitutive power.
Yes. That's the illusion that reason can claim objective reality about the universe as a whole. It takes that power away and instead gives reason a regulative role.
A regulative role. So rather than reason being a map that shows you exactly what the universe looks like, it functions more like a compass or an instruction manual.
That is a perfect way to look at it. The regulative principle is essentially a strict rule for you, the learner, and the observer. It doesn't tell you what the object is. It commands you on how to search.
How to search.
Right. It dictates that you must continually extend your experience and never ever accept any empirical limit as absolute. It transforms a paralyzing mental paradox into a practical working doctrine of endless scientific exploration.
To clarify how this search actually works, the text makes a beautiful distinction between two types of backward searches, an infinite regress, which it calls an infinitum, and an indefinite regress, in indefinitum.
Yes.
Could you break down the difference between those two?
Let's start with the infinite regress, the infinitum. Think about drawing a straight line on a piece of paper, or think about cutting a physical apple in half.
Okay.
The space that makes up that line, or the matter that makes up that apple, is completely given to you in the whole. Because the entire object is right there in front of you. You can theoretically divide that physical space infinitely. There's no logical end to how many times you can cut it in half. That process goes on in infinitum.
But tracing human history or the causes of events in the universe is entirely different.
Exactly. Compare dividing an apple to tracing your own human ancestry. We know for a fact that every single person has parents. So logically, you must always keep looking back.
Right.
However, the absolute totality of all your ancestors, going back to the dawn of humanity, isn't given to you all at once in your present experience. You have to go find them, generation by generation. Therefore, this search proceeds indefinitely, in indefinitum.
So you are required by the regulative rule to always look for a higher condition, a previous ancestor, but you can never reach a point where you claim the series is an actual completed infinity. You just have to keep looking.
Yes. When you apply this rule to the universe, to its size and its age, it demands a profound humility. We cannot say the world has a definite beginning in time or an absolute physical boundary in space.
Because if the universe had a physical boundary, what is on the other side?
Empty space.
But empty space is nothingness, and you cannot experience nothingness. It is impossible.
But we also cannot say the universe is infinitely large or infinitely old because we haven't experienced that infinity. We can only say that our regress, our looking backward in time and outward in space, goes on indefinitely.
The same applies to the divisibility of matter, then. A physical body in space can be divided continually.
Yes, but this does not mean the body consists of an infinite number of discrete parts, just waiting to be separated. The division is a continuous process of experience.
You aren't uncovering a pre-existing infinite number of tiny puzzle pieces.
Right, you are simply engaging in a process of subdivision that has no empirical end.
Everything we've discussed so far, the size of the universe, its age, dividing matter into smaller pieces, these all feel very mechanical. And the text actually categorizes them as mathematical ideas.
They deal with parts that are fundamentally the same. If I cut an apple, I get smaller pieces of apple. If I look back in time, I just find more time that's homogeneous.
But here is where the book makes a massive, fascinating shift. It introduces dynamical ideas. What makes a dynamical idea different?
With mathematical ideas, the condition you are looking for always has to be the exact same kind of thing, a part of the physical series. But dynamical ideas allow for something entirely different, a heterogeneous condition.
Heterogeneous meaning different in kind.
Exactly. This means we can look for a condition or a cause that exists completely outside the series of sensuous phenomena.
This feels like a massive loophole. We spent all this time establishing that we have to follow the physical chain of causes indefinitely, and now Kant is saying there is a completely different kind of cause that operates outside the physical world.
It is a loophole, but a strictly necessary one. This heterogeneous condition is what allows human reason to satisfy its deep, agonizing craving for the unconditioned, the ultimate starting point, without breaking the strict, unbreakable laws of the physical world.
And this brings us to one of the most relatable and honestly most intense struggles in the entire text, the third antinomy. This is the ultimate clash between the iron law of nature and the concept of human freedom.
The stakes are incredibly high here.
They really are. The law of nature dictates that everything is determined, that every single event is caused by a preceding event in an unbroken chain. But human freedom requires the spontaneous origination of an action, something starting entirely of itself, without a prior physical cause. How can both possibly exist?
To resolve this, we have to look at how humans exist in two completely different ways simultaneously. First, there is what the text calls the empirical character.
Okay.
Like every rock, tree, and animal in nature, humans are phenomena. We have an empirical character that has been molded by past events.
Meaning our biology, our genetics, our childhood psychology, the environment we grew up in, the amount of sleep we got last night.
All of it. If you had a supercomputer and you knew absolutely everything about a person's empirical character, every synapse, every past trauma, every environmental factor, you could predict their actions with perfect mathematical certainty, just like predicting a lunar eclipse.
Wow.
In the phenomenal world, determinism is absolute.
But humans also possess reason. And reason, the book argues, operates outside of time.
This is your intelligible character. Because it exists completely outside of the phenomenal world, it knows no before or after. It is not subject to physical laws.
This raises an incredibly important question about morality. Nature only knows what is. Nature cannot tell you what ought to be.
The concept of ought has absolutely no meaning in the physical sciences. A rock falls from a cliff. It doesn't pause to consider if it ought to fall.
But human reason imposes the odd upon us. The very act of looking at a situation and feeling a moral obligation proves that reason operates on a different non-sensuous level.
To really ground this, let's look at the profound example used in the book, a malicious lie.
Right.
Imagine someone tells a terrible, destructive lie that ruins a colleague's reputation. If we investigate this, we can trace all the empirical causes of this action. We can look at their brain chemistry. We can see they had a deeply unstable childhood and a poor education.
We can see they were surrounded by bad company that normalized lying. We can even point to the specific overwhelming stress they were feeling that exact morning.
Exactly. We can map out a perfect, unbreakable chain of physical and psychological causes that made that lie mathematically inevitable.
And yet, despite knowing all of that, society still blames the liar. Why do we do that? If they are just physical machines, blaming them makes no sense.
We blame them because inherently we view their reason as completely free. We act as if their intelligible character, that part of them existing outside of time, could have spontaneously chosen differently.
So we hold them responsible because we believe that reason had the absolute authority to step in and override all of that physical and psychological background.
We do. And so we arrive at this incredible, dizzying harmony. Nature and freedom do not cancel each other out. They run parallel.
The lie is 100% determined by nature in the phenomenal world. It could not have happened any other way physically.
But it is simultaneously 100% free in the intelligible world. The laws of physics and psychology remain perfectly intact, and yet moral responsibility remains absolute.
It is a breathtaking resolution, and from this profound realization that we can have a cause outside the physical series, the text moves to the fourth antinomy. This deals with the necessary being.
Yep.
When the human mind looks at the constant change, the fleeting nature, and the sheer contingency of everything in the physical universe, the fact that things exist but didn't have to exist, it desperately seeks a foundation. It seeks a necessary being to ground it all.
But following the logic we just laid out with human freedom, this necessary being cannot be a physical object hiding somewhere in the universe.
Think about it. If this being were inside the physical world, it would be subject to time. It would be subject to change.
And anything that changes is contingent, meaning it is dependent on something else. Therefore, to be truly necessary, it must be an intelligible condition existing entirely apart from the world of sense.
Exactly. And here the text establishes a very strict regulative boundary. It warns that while you can and perhaps naturally must imagine this necessary being as the ultimate foundation of reality, you can never, ever use it to explain physical events in the real world.
You cannot use it as a scientific shortcut.
Precisely. In nature, you must only look for physical causes. If a volcano erupts, you look for tectonic friction, not the will of the necessary being. You cannot use this intelligible concept to fill in the gaps of your empirical knowledge.
That naturally leads to the question of how the human mind actually manages to build this concept of God or the supreme being in the first place.
Right. If we can't experience it, where does the idea come from?
This is where the book introduces the transcendental ideal. It discusses the ens realissimum, the most real being. The underlying psychological concept here is that to understand a thing completely, you have to compare it to the sum total of all possible realities.
The metaphors used in this section to explain how our minds construct this are quite striking. A person born blind cannot truly understand the concept of darkness because they have never known light.
A vagabond doesn't truly grasp poverty without having a concept of comfort. The text explains that negations like darkness, poverty, or ignorance are not things in themselves.
They are simply limitations or the absence of a greater positive reality.
Yes. So darkness is just a lack of light. Ignorance is just a lack of knowledge. What the human mind naturally does is gather up all these positive realities, infinite knowledge, infinite presence, absolute goodness.
It lumps all of these perfections together into one absolute unconditioned whole, and then it personifies it.
Exactly. This constructed aggregate of all reality becomes our ideal of the supreme being.
But the book doesn't stop at just explaining how human psychology forms the idea. It examines how philosophers historically try to prove this being actually exists in reality, and it heavily focuses on the illusion of the ontological proof.
This is an argument that tries to prove God exists simply by analyzing the very definition of God.
It is a purely logical argument, and it is very seductive.
It is. They use the analogy of a triangle. They say if you have a triangle It must necessarily have three angles. You cannot separate a triangle from its three angles.
Therefore, if you define a perfect being as a being containing all reality and existence as a reality, then that being must necessarily exist. To say a perfect being does not exist is as contradictory as saying a triangle does not have three angles.
The text gently but systematically dismantles this logical leap. It fully agrees with the first part. If a triangle exists, it absolutely must have three angles. That is analytically true.
You cannot separate a subject from its defining predicates.
But, and this is the crucial flaw, that logic does not mean the triangle has to exist in the first place.
Oh.
If you reject the triangle entirely, you also reject its three angles, and there is no contradiction.
So saying God exists because existence is in the definition of God is circular.
Completely. You cannot prove a being's actual objective existence simply by packing the word existence into its definition. The text argues that existence is not a predicate that adds new information to the concept of a thing.
100 imaginary dollars has the exact same definition as 100 real dollars.
The concept is identical. The only difference is whether you actually hold them in your hand.
The Supreme Being remains a beautiful, mathematically perfect, and perhaps necessary ideal that guides human reason, but it is not something we can prove exists through pure logic alone.
We must impartially recognize that while this ideal is the absolute highest product of human thought, our speculative reason cannot cross the physical boundary to prove its objective reality. We are left to marvel at the architecture of our own minds, recognizing that the tools we use to navigate the physical world are the very same tools that compel us to look beyond it, even when we cannot follow.
Let's sit with that quiet profoundness for a moment. It is a beautiful, almost tragic irony of human reason. The very tool we use to meticulously understand the physical universe, to divide matter and track ancestors, is the exact same tool that constantly tries to trick us into believing we can see beyond the physical curtain.
Yeah.
It builds these magnificent, towering ideals like absolute moral freedom and a supreme being. These ideals are absolutely necessary. They guide our morality, they give weight to our choices, and they inspire the endless pursuit of our sciences. Yet they remain forever out of our physical grasp, existing only in the pure space of thought, driving us endlessly forward. And as we hold that thought, we will take this deep understanding of reason's illusions and its highest ideals and push even further into the subsequent chapters of the book without breaking stride. Right, and that brings us seamlessly back into the exact space we were occupying in the text.
With Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason.
Exactly. We are at a really delicate juncture in the book now, and as you sit here with us, maybe reflecting on just the sheer density of what we've been unpacking so far, we are entering Kant's final, pretty devastating deconstruction of the traditional proofs for the existence of a supreme being.
It is, yeah.
And perhaps more crucially, we are arriving at his very subtle shift toward how human reason should actually use these ideas, how to deploy them to drive science and understanding forward, rather than letting them paralyze us.
It's a fascinating maneuver happening right on the page, because up to this point, the book has systematically dismantled the illusions of pure reason. But now, Kant takes aim at the highest structures of philosophical thought, the three great arguments that humanity has historically relied upon to definitively logically prove the existence of God.
Starting with the oldest.
Right. He begins this deconstruction with the oldest of the three, which philosophers call the ontological argument.
And just to lay the groundwork for you here, the ontological argument relies entirely on definition. It's this premise that we can prove God exists simply by defining God as a perfect being.
Right.
The logic essentially goes, well, if God is the most perfect being imaginable and existence is a necessary part of perfection, then God must inherently exist, because otherwise the being in your mind wouldn't be truly perfect. It's this bold attempt to define something into reality.
Precisely. And Kant's response to this is elegant, but it is entirely devastating to the premise.
Yeah.
He introduces a very grounded, very famous analogy in the book, the analogy of the $100.
Ah, yes.
He asks us to consider the logical concept of 100 possible dollars. So in your mind, you can define everything about them. You can picture the texture of the paper, the exact serial numbers, the specific green ink, their exact purchasing power.
Down to the last detail.
Exactly. The concept of those 100 possible dollars contains the exact same properties as 100 real dollars sitting in your actual wallet. So when you take the concept of those dollars in your mind and then simply append the statement, and these dollars exist, you have added absolutely nothing to the concept itself.
The mental image remains completely identical. Saying they exist doesn't change their color or their weight or their value in your imagination, and it certainly doesn't put actual money in your physical hand.
It absolutely does not. And this leads Kant to a monumental conclusion. He says that being or existence is not a real predicate.
Right.
A predicate in a logical sense is supposed to be something that adds new information, something that enlarges a concept. So if I say a ball is red, red is a predicate that adds information. But existence merely posits the thing in reality. It doesn't change the definition of the thing itself.
Oh, wait, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because this is usually where the human mind rebels against this idea. If I can conceive of an absolutely perfect being, doesn't the sheer, overwhelming scale of that idea imply that it must come from somewhere outside my limited, flawed mind? I mean, surely an idea of infinite perfection cannot just be a hollow concept.
It's a very seductive trap. It really is. But Kant anticipates this exact counterargument. He addresses what philosophers call the analytical criterion of possibility. To put it simply, you can imagine a concept without contradicting yourself. Say, a unicorn or a mountain made of pure gold.
Right, there's no logical contradiction there.
Exactly, because the idea doesn't contradict itself like, say, a square circle would. It is logically possible. But logical possibility doesn't give you a bridge to physical reality. You cannot cross the bridge into physical existence just by thinking about it, no matter how grand or perfect the thought actually is.
You can't just think it into being.
No. So if you imagine a supreme being, an entity with every conceivable property, and then you say, and this being exists, you have added zero new information to the concept. You have simply projected your perfectly non-contradictory thought out into the void.
It's a very sobering realization when you really sit with it. He is essentially showing us that our theology isn't grounded in physical reality at all, but rather in the architecture of our own logic.
Yes.
And once Kant gently closes the door on the ontological argument, he turns to the second great pillar, the cosmological argument. Now, this one feels much more tangible, at least initially.
It does.
It's the idea that because you exist, or because the world around us exists, there must be a chain of causes leading all the way back to an absolutely necessary first cause. Because everything comes from something, there must be an ultimate starting point.
It is a very natural way for the human mind to process the world. We are, at our core, creatures of cause and effect. But Kant meticulously unpacks why this, too, ultimately fails as a definitive proof. The cosmological argument makes what we can call a transcendental leap. It takes the law of causality, the rule that every effect has a preceding cause. But remember what the book has firmly established earlier on. Causality is a localized rule. It only works inside our physical, experiential world. It is the mechanism by which our minds organize phenomena in time and space.
Right.
The cosmological argument takes this localized rule of causality and illegally smuggles it outside the universe to explain the origin of the universe itself.
It's sort of like trying to use the rules of chess to explain why the carpenter decided to build the chessboard in the first place.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The rules only apply once the pieces are actually on the board. You can't use a knight's move to explain the existence of wood.
Brilliant way to conceptualize it. You cannot take a cognitive principle designed strictly to navigate human sensory experience and just stretch it into the void beyond all possible experience. And there is an ultimate trap here, a sort of hidden philosophical sleight of hand that Kant exposes.
Which is,
Once the cosmological argument assumes there is this necessary first cause, it has to define what that cause actually is. It has to give it attributes.
Yeah.
And how does it do that?
oh, I see. It has to borrow from the very argument Kant just dismantled.
Exactly. It falls right back into the flawed ontological argument. The cosmological argument assumes that the only thing that could possibly be a necessary first cause is a supremely perfect being. The book uses the Latin phrase ens realissimum, which means the most real being, or the being containing all reality.
So circles back.
It completely circles back. To finish its proof, the cosmological argument secretly relies on the assumption that the ens realissimum exists simply because it is the most perfect concept. So it pretends to start from physical experience, the fact that the world exists, but it inevitably hits a wall and reverts to pretending an abstract concept has physical existence.
Wow. Which naturally leads us to the third and, frankly, the most emotionally resonant argument of all, the physico-theological argument, or as it's more commonly known, the argument from design.
Yes, the big one.
When you look up at the night sky or examine the intricate biology of a human eye, or just the symmetry of a snowflake, you see overwhelming order and seemingly deliberate design. Doesn't this magnificent architecture prove there must be a creator?
It is deeply moving. And what is really vital to note here is the deep respect Kant actually has for this specific argument. He doesn't dismiss it with the same clinical detachment he used for the others.
He's quite gentle with it.
He is. The book explicitly states that this is the oldest, clearest, and most natural argument to human reason. It animates the study of nature. It gives scientists the motivation to look closer. Kant validates the emotional and rational pull of looking at the universe and feeling the undeniable presence of design.
He uses an analogy of human art in the text to validate why we think this way, right? Just as when we look at a house or a ship or the intricate gears of a pocket watch, we immediately infer that there was a human builder, a conscious intelligence behind the construction.
Exactly.
So it is perfectly natural that when we look at the intricate gears of the cosmos, we infer a cosmic builder.
The analogy of art is crucial here. But here comes Kant's rigorous counterpoint, delivered with his characteristic precision. The argument from design, based entirely on the analogy of human art, only proves the existence of an architect of the universe.
An architect, not a creator.
Right. An architect is someone who works with pre-existing matter, shaping, organizing, and molding it into a structure. It does not prove a creator who conjured the matter itself out of absolute nothingness.
That is a fundamental distinction. Proving an architect proves a being of immense, unimaginably vast power, sure, but it doesn't get you to a being of mathematically infinite or absolutely necessary power.
Precisely. The designer of the watch didn't create the raw iron and brass out of a void. They merely arranged the metals. So the physico-theological argument looks at the beautiful arrangement of the world and proves a very wise arranger. But theology demands an absolutely infinite, all-sufficient supreme being.
So how does it bridge that gap?
Well, to make the leap from a very wise, incredibly powerful architect to an infinite creator, what does the argument do? It has to borrow from the cosmological argument. It claims this architect is the necessary first cause of the material itself.
Oh, and here we go again.
Exactly. And we already know the cosmological argument borrows from the ontological argument to define that first cause as the ens realissimum. To reach absolute infinity, this beautiful empirical argument secretly falls back on the discredited idea that we can simply define a perfect being into existence. None of these proofs can stand on their own. They all collapse into the exact same logical fallacy.
It's unsettling, honestly, because if Kant is right, the human mind is essentially a machine that builds horizons it can never actually reach. We look for the ultimate cause, the ultimate design, because our brains are naturally wired to demand unity, not because that unity is tangibly sitting out there in the void.
It's a heavy realization.
Which brings us to a really profound moment of intellectual silence in the text. If pure reason cannot definitively prove God, cannot prove the eternal soul, cannot prove the totality of the universe as physical objects we can grasp. I almost used an ellipsis there. Sorry, I mean, what is the point of these ideas? Why does human reason inevitably and constantly produce them? Are they just cognitive errors?
This is where the text executes a fascinating shift. Instead of discarding these profound ideas as useless illusions, Kant pivots. He introduces the crucial difference between constitutive and regulative principles.
Okay, I'll break those down for a sec.
Constitutive principles are the rules that actually create or define actual objects of experience, like the categories of understanding we discussed earlier, which allow you to perceive a physical table or a chair. But the ideas of pure reason, God, the soul, the infinite universe, are not constitutive. They do not create actual objects we can touch or measure.
They aren't objects in themselves.
No. Instead, they are regulative.
Regulative, meaning they regulate, they guide, they set a trajectory.
Yes, they are subjective rules. The book uses a deeply evocative Latin phrase here, a focus imaginarius, an imaginary focal point. Think of a vanishing point in a perspective painting, or the way objects in a mirror appear to be located behind the glass.
Right.
The lines in the painting all converge at a point that doesn't actually exist in physical space on the canvas. But you absolutely need that imaginary point to organize the entire picture, to give it depth, proportion, and structure. These profound ideas, God, the soul, the universe, are the vanishing points for human reason. They organize our minds.
So they aren't facts about the universe. They are the necessary architecture of our own questioning.
Exactly.
And this brings us to how reason systematically organizes knowledge using these regulative ideas. The book outlines 3 logical principles of reason, 3 distinct laws our minds use to bring order to the terrifying chaos of sensory information. Let's linger on these because they are so applicable to how you, listening to this right now by the fire, process the world around you every single day. The first is the principle of homogeneity, or genera.
The principle of homogeneity is the mind's relentless, almost desperate drive to find unity. It is our psychological refusal to accept that the world is just an infinite, disconnected pile of random facts. We see this powerfully in the sciences.
How so?
Well, the book gives the historical example of chemists. For centuries, chemists have observed a vast, confusing variety of salts, earths, and metals. But they didn't stop there. They constantly tried to reduce them down to just a few fundamental elements. Why? Because the human mind demands that nature is unified at its core. We naturally assume there is a hidden identity, a primal sameness beneath the diverse surface of things. We assume the universe is a single, cohesive puzzle.
We want a unified theory of everything. We want to find the one root from which all the branches grow. But if we only had that drive for unity, everything would just collapse into a single featureless point. We would look at the world and just say matter and learn nothing else.
Right.
Which is why this drive has to be balanced by the second law, the principle of specification or species.
That is the balancing drive for diversity. The mind absolutely refuses to stop at a broad general category. It insists on diving deeper, finding subspecies, and tracing infinite microscopic differences.
So it's pulling in the opposite direction.
Exactly. If homogeneity is the mind looking at a sprawling forest and saying, those are trees, specification is the mind walking into that forest and saying, this is an oak, this is a maple, this is a pine. And it doesn't stop there. It examines the slight variations in the bark of a single oak branch, the different shapes of the leaves, the cellular structure of the sap. Reason demands that no species is the lowest possible. There are always finer distinctions to be made. It is the drive for meticulous classification.
It's a really delicate tension, pulling everything together into unity while simultaneously pushing everything apart into infinite detail. And these two opposing forces are bridged by the third law, the principle of continuity or affinity.
The principle of continuity dictates that there are no empty gaps in nature. The text uses the phrase non datur vacuum formarum. It means nature transitions smoothly. There isn't a violent, inexplicable jump from one species to another entirely unrelated one. There's a continuous spectrum of gradual changes.
The book provides an incredible astronomical analogy here that grounds this abstract concept beautifully. Think about the history of how humanity mapped the heavens.
It is a perfect illustration of human reason casting a net of systematic unity over the cosmos. When early astronomers looked up, they observed the movements of the planets. Applying the drive for unity, they assumed these orbits must be perfect circles, the ultimate unified symmetrical shape.
Right.
But as our observations grew more meticulous, applying the principle of specification, we noticed deviations. The planets weren't moving in perfect circles.
So we didn't throw out the idea of order. We looked closer at the diversity of the movement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We realized they were ellipses, circles that had been slightly stretched. But then astronomers looked at comets. Comets behave erratically. They come blazing in from the dark, cut across the solar system, and often don't loop back around in a closed path. So how do we fit these chaotic wanderers into our unified system?
Right, they threatened to break the whole model.
But reason, demanding continuity, realizes that a comet moves in a parabola. And what is a parabola? Mathematically, it is simply an ellipse stretched out to infinity.
From a closed circle to a stretched ellipse to an open parabola.
Yes. There are no gaps. The mind connected the seemingly distinct, unrelated movements of planets and comets by finding a continuous geometric relationship between them. This wasn't nature handing us a neatly labeled map. This was human reason, using its regulative principles to force an understandable continuity onto the terrifying vastness of the stars.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we set out to answer. If we are using these regulative principles, these focus imaginarius concepts, to organize science and our understanding of nature, how are we supposed to use the ultimate idea? How are we supposed to use the concept of a supreme being?
The book's answer is a triumph of philosophical balance. Kant argues that we must look at the universe as if it were designed by a supreme intelligence.
As if. Those two words carry the weight of the entire critique.
They do. The idea of a perfectly wise creator becomes the ultimate heuristic tool. If we approach nature as if every single part of it was placed there with profound purpose by a supreme being, it forces scientists to never give up. It forces them to keep looking for hidden mechanisms, hidden rules, hidden purposes, even when things look utterly chaotic or useless. It provides the motivation to keep digging.
The book gives a remarkably specific example regarding the shape of the Earth itself. The Earth is not a perfect sphere. It is an oblate spheroid. It's flat at the poles and bulges out significantly at the equator.
Now, If you look at that equatorial bulge as just a random, meaningless accident of cooling rocks spinning in space, you stop investigating. You accept it as a random flaw. But if you apply the regulative idea of a supreme being, you approach that bulge as if it is a piece of wise, intentional design.
And what happens when you do that?
When scientists investigated the Earth's shape with that specific mindset, they discovered something incredible. They found that this exact bulge of mass at the equator acts as a necessary counterweight. It prevents the Earth's axis from violently shifting and wobbling due to the uneven massive weight of mountain ranges and continents. What initially looked like a structural flaw is actually a masterful stabilizing mechanism.
Approaching it as if it had a purpose led directly to a massive scientific discovery. That is the proper, productive use of the idea of God. But Kant issues a severe warning here. There is an ultimate danger when we misuse this idea. The danger of what he calls ignovatio, lazy reason.
Ignovatio is the death of intellectual progress. Lazy reason happens when a thinker, instead of using the idea of God to push them forward to find physical mechanisms, uses the idea of God as an excuse to stop working.
To just give up.
Yeah. Imagine a medical researcher looking at a complex, devastating disease. If they encounter a mystery in the biology, and instead of doing the grueling, relentless work of investigating cellular causes, they simply throw up their hands and say, it is God's will. They have fallen into lazy reason.
It's the ultimate intellectual shortcut. It is using an absolute concept to pave over our own ignorance.
And it ruins both science and philosophy.
Mm.
If you treat a supreme being as a constitutive fact, a literal physical mechanism that can be used to explain away the gaps in our physical knowledge, you destroy the very foundation of empirical science. You stop observing. You stop questioning. The idea of God, Kant argues, should never be an answer that shuts down an investigation. It must be the overarching hypothesis that demands we investigate deeper endlessly to uncover the magnificent hidden mechanics of the natural world.
And as we sit here, letting the implications of this shift settle, we have to connect this directly to our own lives, to your life, listening to this. How often do we do exactly what Kant warns against? How often do we use absolute concepts, be it absolute purpose or destiny or the idea of a perfectly ordered universe, to prematurely stop our own questioning?
It's a fair question.
How often do we accept ignovatio, lazy reason, simply because it is more comfortable than staring into the terrifying infinite complexity of the truth?
It is a profound vulnerability to admit that we do not have the ultimate answers physically in our hands, to accept that we cannot define the universe into a neat, solvable equation. But what Kant has shown us is that this limitation is not a tragedy. It is the very engine of human progress. The core realization of this entire text is breathtaking. The ideas of a perfectly unified soul, a complete and bounded universe, and an absolutely perfect God, these are not physical realities we can hold, measure, or prove with logic. But they are something perhaps even more vital. They are the internal compasses that allow our minds to navigate the dark, infinite seas of the unknown. They are the vanishing points that give our existence perspective and depth.
They don't give us the map. They give us the ability to draw the map ourselves. And that leaves us lingering on a final, deeply provocative thought. If our minds are perfectly, inherently structured to constantly chase a horizon of ultimate unity, a horizon that we can never, by definition, actually reach, then what does that endless, beautiful pursuit reveal about the invisible architecture of our own consciousness? Which leads us directly into how we actually apply this delicate balance.
And carrying that exact thought forward from where we just left off, stepping carefully through this vast architecture of human cognition, we find ourselves in a rather humbling space. We're turning our attention back to the book Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. It really is a monumental text that essentially maps out the absolute immovable limits of human thought.
It is. And it's a quiet space we are entering now.
Yes. For this phase of the journey with you, as we sit here contemplating these boundaries, our mission is to examine something deeply necessary. We need to understand how human reason must discipline itself. Specifically, how it has to restrain its own natural, almost desperate desires when it tries to reach out into the dark, beyond the physical world. And there's a beautiful architectural metaphor in the book that perfectly captures where we find ourselves at this exact moment.
It is a striking image to sit with, really. The text asks us to imagine that human reason initially sets out to build a magnificent tower, a structure of pure speculation meant to reach all the way to heaven. The goal is to elevate ourselves high enough to grasp the ultimate concepts: God, eternity, the immortal soul. We start gathering our conceptual building blocks with this grand, transcendent ambition. But upon a closer, highly critical inspection of those materials, reason discovers a sobering truth.
We just don't have the materials for a tower, do we?
We don't. We realize we only have enough elements for a sturdy terrestrial dwelling. We have just enough to build a house spacious enough for our earthly purposes, and just high enough to survey the flat plane of human experience. The bold undertaking of a tower to heaven necessarily fails because our materials, our human concepts, are strictly designed to work within the physical world of space and time.
It is such a heavy realization to sit with, to accept that the highest faculty of the human mind, our pure reason, actually requires discipline to stop it from building those doomed towers. And the way the book defines discipline is quite different from how we normally use the word in everyday life. It is not about practicing a skill or learning something new. It contrasts discipline with what it calls culture. Could you break that difference down for us?
I'd be glad to. Think of culture in this philosophical context as a positive force. It produces talent, it expands our capabilities, adds to our knowledge, gives us new tools. If you are learning to play the piano, culture is the process of gaining that physical and mental skill over time. But in the realm of pure reason, discipline is a purely negative force.
Meaning it doesn't add anything.
Right. It is not about adding anything at all. It is the strict restraint required to extinguish reason's constant innate urge to wander into errors.
So it is like our minds naturally want to build those castles in the sky.
Exactly. Reason desperately wants to transcend everyday experience. It wants the ultimate answers. Discipline is the corrective training that represses that urge. It is the mechanism that essentially slaps our hand away when we try to play notes that don't actually exist on the keyboard of human experience.
And it needs this negative restraint precisely because when we start thinking about things outside of physical space and time, in that transcendental fear, we are flying blind. We do not have the safety net of physical, empirical evidence to catch us. If I make a mistake in earthly physics, the physical world eventually corrects me. An experiment fails. A bridge collapses. But if I make a mistake in pure metaphysics,
there is nothing in the void to stop you from spinning off into endless illusion. The physical world cannot correct you because you have left the physical world entirely behind. And this brings us to one of the most delicate distinctions in the book: the treatment of transcendental theology and the idea of a supreme intelligence, or God. The book asks us to carefully, quietly separate two ways of using this idea. We can try to use it as a constitutive principle, or we can use it as a regulative principle.
okay, those are heavy terms. Let's take them one at a time so we can really picture this. What happens if I use the idea of a supreme intelligence as a constitutive principle?
If you use it as a constitutive principle, you are claiming that this intelligence actually exists as a definable, literal object that actively causes nature. You are turning a mental idea into a physical reality. The philosophical term for this is hypostatizing, but simply put, it means treating a concept as if it were a tangible thing, making physical things happen in the universe.
That sounds like how a majority of people historically looked at the world. Why does the book argue that is a problem for reason?
Because doing this actually destroys the unity of nature. Imagine you are a scientist studying how a flower blooms. If you suddenly say, a divine being simply willed this specific flower to bloom right now, you have just stepped completely outside the laws of physics. You have introduced a hyperphysical cause into a chain of physical events. It leads to circular arguments where we presuppose the very divine perfection we are trying to prove. And worse, the rigorous, everyday work of natural science simply stops. You stop looking for the biological mechanism.
I see. Because you just default to a miracle. So the alternative the text offers is to use this idea purely as a regulative principle. I'm trying to picture how that works in practice. There's a visual analogy that helps me hold this thought. Tell me if this tracks. It is like a vanishing point in a perspective drawing. When you look at a painting of a long road, the vanishing point isn't a physical brick on that road. You cannot touch it. But by pretending it is there, by aiming all your drawn lines toward that imaginary dot on the horizon, you organize the entire picture into a unified, coherent, three-dimensional landscape.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it, yes. The book argues we must use the idea of a supreme author exactly like that vanishing point. It directs us to look at nature as if it were designed by a supreme, perfect intelligence.
As if. That is the operative phrase.
It is the absolute key. This mental framework forces us to keep looking for systematic unity. It pushes a scientist to keep searching for the hidden general laws of nature because they are operating under the fruitful assumption that a perfect, interconnected order exists to be found.
So we can look at a complex ecosystem and say, look at the wisdom of nature, or look at how carefully this is designed. As long as we maintain the discipline to remember, We're just using human anthropomorphic terms to help us organize our research.
Precisely. It is a schema, a tool for our own minds to organize human experience, not a literal proof of a deity sitting outside the universe pulling physical levers. It requires a very careful, deliberate balancing act of the mind.
It really does.
Yeah.
And navigating that balance seems so difficult that I imagine philosophers look over at mathematicians with intense jealousy. Mathematics seems to offer absolute, undeniable certainty. It's just so tempting for philosophers to just copy the mathematicians' homework to prove their metaphysical ideas. Why can't they just do that?
The temptation is immense, but the book dismantles this temptation entirely by looking at how the two fields actually function at the deepest level of cognition. They operate in fundamentally different ways. Mathematics works by the construction of conceptions in pure intuition.
Let's unpack that quietly for a moment. What does construction of conceptions actually look like in the mind?
It means mathematics can literally visualize its concepts. It moves from the general definition to the particular object. Let's take the geometer mentioned in the book as an example.
Okay, let's say I ask a philosopher and a mathematician to figure out the interior angles of a triangle. What does the philosopher do?
The philosopher relies entirely on words. Their process is discursive. So they will sit there endlessly analyzing the definition of a triangle. They will dissect the concept of three straight lines enclosed in a space over and over. But no matter how hard they think about those words, they will never discover any new property not already contained in that phrase. They cannot find the exact angles just by analyzing the definition of the shape.
And the mathematician.
The mathematician does not just think discursively, they literally draw the triangle. They construct it, either in their mind's eye or on a piece of paper. They might draw an auxiliary line parallel to the base, and through that visual construction, they suddenly see that the angles equal two right angles, or 180 degrees. They discover new truths because they can actually see the proof unfold in intuition. Philosophy cannot do that. You cannot draw a picture of the concept of substance. You cannot sketch cause and effect on a chalkboard.
Because philosophical concepts are not visual. They move from the particular experience to the general rule, but they can never just summon an object out of thin air to examine it.
Exactly. Therefore, the tools of mathematics are strictly forbidden in philosophy. The book explicitly outlaws three specific mathematical tools for the philosopher.
Let's walk through those carefully. The first forbidden tool is definitions. But philosophers use definitions all the time, do they not?
They do, but not in the mathematical sense. In mathematics, you create the object by defining it. An arbitrary mathematical concept like a perfect circle is exactly what the definition says it is. Nothing more, nothing less. But in philosophy, you are given a concept like right or justice or cause in a somewhat confused everyday state, and you must analyze it.
And because we are human, our analysis might be flawed or incomplete.
Right. Human analysis is never guaranteed to be completely exhaustive. We can never be perfectly sure we haven't missed a hidden attribute of a complex concept like justice. Therefore, philosophical definitions are never absolute. The book prefers to call them expositions. A full philosophical exposition should be the end result of your laborious investigation, not the starting point.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, the second forbidden tool is axioms. In math, an axiom is just a universally accepted truth. Like the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. We just see it in our minds. It is self-evident. Cannot philosophers start with self-evident truths?
They would love to, but the text forbids that too. Mathematics can use axioms because, as you just said, you can instantly see them in your intuition. But philosophy requires a bridge. It requires the mediating term of human experience.
Give me an example of a philosophical principle that feels like an axiom but actually isn't.
Think about the phrase, every event has a cause. That feels instinctively true to us, but it is not a self-evident axiom you can just picture. You cannot immediately connect the abstract concept of an event with the abstract concept of a cause without a bridge.
And what is that bridge?
Time and possible human experience. You have to understand how time flows to understand an event causing another event. Because it requires that extra mediating step of human experience, it is not an axiom. It is a discursive principle, which requires lengthy, hard deductive work to prove.
Wow, okay, so no definitions, no axioms. The third forbidden tool is demonstrations. What does that mean in this specific context?
Mathematics uses apodictic proofs. These are demonstrations where the truth is visibly, intuitively constructed before your very eyes, like drawing that triangle we talked about. Philosophy, stripped of that visual intuition, relies on what the text calls achromatic proofs.
Achromatic. Let's soften that word a bit. What does an achromatic proof actually look like?
It just means a purely word-based argumentative proof. You have to argue your way from one concept to another using logic and language alone. So if a philosopher tries to adorn their work with the absolute dogmatic certainty of mathematical demonstrations, pretending they have mathematically proven the existence of the soul, they are merely building card castles.
And card castles inevitably invite someone else to come along and knock them down. Which pulls us right into the arena of polemics, the defensive battles of pure reason. We're talking about the grand historical debates over these massive ideas, the immortality of the soul, the origins of the universe, the existence of a supreme being.
In this arena, the book insists on total, unyielding intellectual freedom. Reason is not a dictator. It is not a dogmatic authority handing down edicts from on high. The book beautifully compares reason to the collective vote of free citizens. Every single member of this intellectual state must be allowed to voice their doubts without fear of censorship.
Even when those doubts terrify the general public, there's always a societal fear that free thinkers, and the book mentions historical figures like David Hume or Joseph Priestley, will destroy the foundations of morality or religion by questioning these transcendent ideas.
Yes, even then, the book's stance is deeply principled here. Using dishonest, dogmatic tricks to defend a so-called good cause is vastly more damaging to the human spirit than honest skepticism. If you defend a sacred belief with a flawed, illusory argument, you are corrupting the very nature of reason itself. Deceit and misrepresentation are fatal to the intellect. We must allow the skeptics to speak freely because they force reason to examine its own limits.
The imagery the text uses for these endless dogmatic debates is almost haunting. Because neither side can bring empirical, physical proof to the table to settle the argument once and for all. They are just beating the air. They're like the phantom heroes in Valhalla.
Yes, the Norse mythology analogy. It is so fitting for this.
They endlessly hack each other to pieces on the battlefield of metaphysics. But because they are fighting with shadows, with concepts completely untethered from physical experience, they suffer no real wounds. They just spring right back up and start fighting again the next day. It is a bloodless, unceasing, and entirely futile contest. No one ever truly wins.
And this endless shadow fighting is exactly what gives rise to skepticism, which the book explores deeply through the figure of David Hume. Skepticism is not just a nuisance. It is a natural, almost healthy reaction to watching the dogmatists build their crumbling card castles over and over again.
The text actually expresses a profound respect for Hume, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We can appreciate him for waking reason up from its dogmatic slumber. He looked at a concept like cause and effect and realized it wasn't some magical logical law that exists independently of the human mind. He saw the fatal flaws in the dogmatist's armor.
He certainly did. But the book points out Hume's crucial error, too. Hume saw the horizon of human knowledge, but he didn't map the globe.
What do you mean by that? The book uses a geographic analogy here, I believe.
Yes. Think of skepticism as standing on a flat Earth. You look out, you see a visual horizon where your sight ends, and you simply guess that your knowledge stops there. You do not know what lies beyond that line, and you do not know the actual mathematical nature of the boundary. You just know you cannot see past it. So you just throw your hands up and say, we cannot know anything for sure.
But the method of this book, what it calls criticism, takes a radically different approach. It realizes that human reason is not an endless flat plane. It is a sphere.
Exactly. By calculating the curvature of that sphere, by understanding the deepest a priori principles of how our minds process information, we can precisely determine its circumference and its absolute extent. We do not just guess at a hazy horizon. We calculate the eternal limits of what human cognition can and cannot do. We know exactly where the boundary of possible experience lies.
So skepticism is a vital, necessary resting place to cure our dogmatic pride. It wakes us up. But it's never a permanent home for human thought. We have to move from the flat earth of skepticism to the mathematically measured sphere of criticism.
Well said. And once we know we are living on that sphere, permanently bound by the limits of possible experience, it drastically changes how we are allowed to guess about the world. When scientists don't know something for sure, they form hypotheses. But the book lays down incredibly strict rules for this.
What is the golden rule for making a hypothesis under this framework?
The golden rule is that a hypothesis must always be connected to possible experience. If we are trying to explain a physical phenomenon in nature, we cannot invent new, hyperphysical forces to explain it. We cannot hypothesize spirits or telepathy or the direct, unmediated intervention of a divine architect to explain why a physical phenomenon occurs.
Because if you do that, science simply stops. If a scientist finds a weird magnetic anomaly and says, well, ghosts did it, they stop investigating the physical laws of electromagnetism.
Precisely. The text calls this lazy reason. It is an intellectual shortcut that immediately halts the hard, laborious work of natural science. A valid hypothesis must deal with forces and substances that could, theoretically, be encountered in the physical world, even if we just do not have the instruments to see them right now.
However, there's one fascinating exception where the book actually permits us to use transcendental hyperphysical hypotheses, and that is purely for the sake of self-defense.
Ah, yes, the polemical defense.
Walk us through how that works. Let's say a dogmatic opponent attacks me with an absolute, unprovable claim. For instance, they confidently assert that materialism is the absolute truth and that human consciousness is nothing but a decaying physical mechanism, and when the brain dies, the soul vanishes entirely. They cannot prove that empirically, but they assert it as a fact. What am I allowed to do?
In that specific intellectual combat, you are permitted to invent an equally wild, unprovable hypothesis to counter them. You might hypothesize that the physical body is merely a restrictive dream state, a temporary limitation placed upon an eternal, immaterial spirit.
But I'm not advancing this hypothesis because I genuinely believe I can prove it, am I?
No, not at all. You advance it simply to show your opponent that their dogmatic claim is just as baseless as your wild speculation. It levels the playing field. It demonstrates that neither of you has the empirical knowledge to make absolute claims beyond physical experience. The shadow fighters effectively cancel each other out, restoring the peace. It is a brilliant, quiet way to disarm intellectual arrogance.
It really is. It forces a stalemate. Which leads us nicely to the final realization of this section of the text, the strict rules for constructing actual, valid philosophical proofs. If we're going to build that sturdy terrestrial dwelling we spoke of at the very beginning, we have to follow a rigorous architectural code.
The text outlines 3 strict rules for transcendental proofs. Rule 1. Before you even begin your argument, you must first prove that the concepts you are using have objective validity. You must link them to possible experience.
So I cannot just take a pure abstract idea like absolute simplicity or an uncaused cause and start logically deducing things from it in a vacuum. I have to prove how it connects to the world we actually perceive in space and time.
Exactly. Without that anchor to experience, you are just playing with words. Rule 2 is perhaps the most austere of them all. A transcendental proposition can only have one single proof.
Let's pause on that because that feels counterintuitive. If someone is trying to convince me of something, say that the human soul exists, and they give me 10 different arguments, doesn't it make their case stronger?
The book warns us to be deeply suspicious of that approach in philosophy. If someone brings 10 different arguments, they are acting like a slippery lawyer. They are trying different rhetorical arguments on different judges, hoping one will subjectively stick to the wall. Because a true transcendental truth relies on a single underlying condition of human experience, there can be only one essential objective ground of proof. If you possess the true fundamental proof, you do not need the other 9.
Those extra 9 arguments are just illusions of certainty meant to overwhelm the listener. I see. And finally, Rule 3. Proofs must be direct. The text calls them ostensive. They cannot be indirect proofs by contradiction.
This is a crucial distinction between math and philosophy again. In mathematics, you can safely use an indirect proof. You assume the opposite of your proposition is true, you show that it leads to a mathematical contradiction, and thereby you prove your original point.
But in philosophy, the book warns that indirect proofs are incredibly dangerous. Why is that?
Because you might easily mistake your own subjective inability to imagine something for an objective impossibility.
Could you give me an example to help visualize that?
Sure. Imagine trying to think of a color completely outside the visible spectrum of the rainbow. You subjectively cannot imagine it. Your mind fails. But does your subjective inability to picture it mean that such a color is objectively impossible in the universe? No.
Ah. So an opposing philosophical idea might not be genuinely contradictory to reality. It might just be contradictory to our limited human way of thinking.
Precisely. A valid philosophical proof must directly establish its truth and expose the very grounds of its possibility, not merely poke dialectical holes in the alternative.
Which brings us to a space of profound, almost echoing humility. This discipline we have been exploring together, it strips away our grandest illusions. It takes away the tower reaching to heaven. It forces us to put down the weapons of the phantom warriors in Valhalla. But in doing so, in restricting us to the sphere of possible experience, it firmly, permanently secures the knowledge we can actually possess. It protects the earthly dwelling. And as we sit with that realization, I invite you to meditate on this lingering thought. If our reason truly is a perfectly measurable sphere, and we have calculated its exact curvature and limits, what does it mean for our everyday lives, for our deepest hopes, that we are permanently bound to its surface, looking out at an infinite void we can never truly comprehend?
And so as we continue turning these pages, we find ourselves standing right at the edge of a very vast conceptual map.
We really are. We're finally looking at the culmination of this book.
Yeah, and it's difficult not to feel this quiet sense of awe at what Kant is attempting to do here. I mean, we are looking at nothing less than the exact cartography of human understanding.
That's beautifully put.
He spent so much time carefully, almost delicately, establishing exactly what your mind can and cannot know without relying on physical experience. We've seen the boundaries drawn. We know exactly where the solid ground of experience ends.
It's a profound boundary to reach.
Mm-hmm.
And the mission for this final stretch of the book is about what happens in the quiet moments after you hit that wall.
Right.
We are examining what happens when pure reason looks out over that boundary, realizes it absolutely cannot know everything through theoretical speculation, and must therefore turn its gaze toward something else entirely.
It has to pivot.
Exactly. It has to pivot toward morality, toward belief,
Yeah.
and toward the ultimate architecture of human knowledge.
But before we explore that architecture, there is a very specific warning Kant issues about how we argue, especially when we are standing at the edge of pure reason.
Yes, the warning against apagogic proofs.
Apagogic proofs. Now, to make sure I am grasping this fully, an apagogic proof is essentially a proof by contradiction, right?
Essentially, yes.
It's this seductive idea that you can prove a statement is true simply by proving that its exact opposite is false. It feels like a neat logical trick. Like, if option B is entirely wrong, option A simply must be right.
It does feel intuitive, which is exactly why Kant considers it so dangerous when we are dealing with pure reason. I mean, in the physical world or in pure mathematics, that kind of indirect proof might work beautifully.
Sure, because the parameters are set.
Right. But in the realm of philosophical speculation, Kant points out a devastating third option. Both opposing statements might be based on an entirely impossible, flawed conception. Think about it. If the foundation itself is an illusion, then what you affirm and what you deny are equally untrue.
Because you're arguing over a phantom.
You cannot arrive at the truth by disproving a falsehood if both sides are swinging at shadows.
That makes me think of the gladiator metaphor Kant uses, which paints such a vivid, almost tragic picture. He compares this kind of arguing to a champion fighter in an arena who defends his party by simply offering battle to anyone who dares to doubt him.
It's a relentless cycle.
It really is. Someone attacks his claim, they fight, and the attacker always seems to win. Then another attacker steps up, and they win. If you are sitting in the stands watching this, each party is alternately the conqueror and the conquered.
And as a spectator to that violence, what do you conclude? You would naturally be led to despair. You'd assume that the truth of the dispute is simply beyond the power of humanity to ever figure out.
But it isn't.
No, and Kant whispers a rather brilliant secret to us here. The reason the fighters are endlessly defeating each other isn't because the truth is unknowable. It's because, as we said, they are both basing their arguments on a completely false premise.
Like the argument over whether the universe is finite or infinite.
Precisely. If you argue over whether a completely given infinite world is finite or infinite in space, you're wasting your breath.
Because the very idea of a completely given infinite world is a self-contradiction.
Exactly. You cannot have a completed infinity. Therefore, both the argument that it is finite and the argument that it is infinite are false, because the hypothesis itself is an illusion.
So you can't just disprove the other guy to win.
No. This is why Kant insists on the direct method of proof. You must establish your assertions by showing the actual grounds of your proof, not just by poking holes in the other person's argument. When you force yourself to build an argument from the ground up, you quickly discover the dogmatic illusions you've been clinging to.
Which humbles human reason. It's this quiet, almost reverent realization that our minds are simply incompetent to discover ultimate truths through pure speculation alone.
It is humbling.
But he doesn't leave us in despair. He suggests that once reason sets its own bounds, what remains within those bounds is entirely secure from attack.
It is entirely secure. But we do have to acknowledge a deep psychological reality about human nature here. Reason cannot help but want to venture beyond those bounds.
It's irresistible.
It is. You, me, everyone listening, we have this inextinguishable desire to find a firm footing somewhere beyond the physical world. Kant identifies three ultimate things that pure reason deeply inherently cares about.
The freedom of the will, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God.
Those are the massive, towering ideas of human history.
They are. But here's where I need to ask for some clarity, because Kant does something quite unexpected. He dissects these three concepts and calmly states that they are actually practically useless for speculative theoretical science.
Yes.
But wait, if a physicist somehow did prove the soul was immortal, wouldn't that completely upend science? Why does he argue it's practically useless?
It is a jarring thought at first, but let's sit with his reasoning. Suppose you could theoretically prove the soul is immortal. What could a physicist actually do with that information in a laboratory?
I suppose. Nothing mechanically.
Exactly. You could never use that fact to explain natural phenomena. You couldn't use it to explain the mechanics of the human body, or gravity, or thermodynamics. Our conception of a soul is what Kant calls an incorporeal nature.
Meaning it lacks physical body or physical substance?
Right. And because it lacks physical substance, it doesn't add a single workable law to our scientific empirical knowledge. Science requires mechanics. The soul offers none.
I see. And the same logic applies to proving the existence of a supreme intelligence. Even if we could prove it theoretically, Kant argues we wouldn't be justified in using that intelligence to deduce any particular arrangement of the physical world.
We can't just wave away natural causes.
Right, we can't ignore a chemical reaction by saying, well, the supreme intelligence willed it so. That stops being science.
It transcends all our scientific knowledge and halts the real work of understanding the physical world, which leads us to a crucial concept in the book, the canon.
The canon of pure reason.
Yes, because speculative reason utterly fails to make scientific use of these three great ideas: freedom, immortality, and God. The only proper use of pure reason must be practical. A canon, in this context, is a set of foundational rules or principles.
And since speculative use is impossible here, the canon must relate entirely to how we act and how we form our morals.
Exactly. That shift from what we can mathematically know to how we should morally act is beautifully summarized in the three great questions of humanity. Kant says all the interests of human reason center on just three questions.
If you've ever stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m. trying to figure out your place in the universe, you are basically asking these.
We all do.
He asks, what can I know? Then what ought I to do? And finally, what may I hope?
Those three questions are the pillars of the human experience. The first question, what can I know, is purely theoretical. And as we've explored, what you can know is strictly limited to the boundaries of your physical experience.
And the second question, what ought I to do?
That is purely practical. It is the absolute foundation of morality. And the third question, what may I hope, bridges the gap between the two.
Because it's practical in its foundation, but it leads to a theoretical conclusion about the universe.
Precisely. All hoping eventually points toward happiness.
And here, Kant draws a very sharp distinction between two types of laws that govern our pursuit of happiness: pragmatic laws and moral laws. But before we define those, he gives us a definition of happiness that sounds incredibly dense at first glance.
It does.
He describes happiness as satisfying our desires across three dimensions. He says they are extensive in their multiplicity, intensive in their degree, and protensive in their duration. What does he actually mean by that?
It sounds complex, but it's actually a very totalizing, relatable view of happiness.
Yeah.
Extensive in their multiplicity simply means how many different desires you are able to satisfy.
Okay, the breadth of satisfaction.
Yes, intensive in their degree refers to how deeply or intensely you feel that satisfaction. And protensive is a term for duration, how long those feelings of happiness actually last.
So true happiness isn't just a fleeting moment.
No. Kant is saying true happiness is the absolute, enduring satisfaction of all your desires across every single dimension.
That makes perfect sense. So, looking at how we get there, Kant outlines pragmatic laws. A pragmatic law is essentially a rule of prudence based on human experience. It tells you what you need to do if you wish to possess that happiness.
It's practical advice.
Right, like, if you want to be happy, you should probably eat well, find a good job, and avoid toxic people.
Well,
But a moral law is something entirely different. A moral law doesn't care about your practical means of satisfying desires.
Not at all.
A moral law dictates solely how you ought to act in order to deserve happiness.
To deserve it. That is a breathtaking distinction to quietly reflect on. The pragmatic rule is about acquiring happiness. The moral rule is about being worthy of it.
And this leads right into the concept of the supreme good, or the summum bonum.
Yes. Kant makes us marvel at the idea that happiness alone, by itself, is not the complete good. If you see someone who is incredibly happy, but you know they are deeply corrupt and immoral, your reason naturally rejects their happiness as unjust.
It feels wrong.
But similarly, perfect morality alone, lived in absolute misery without any hope of happiness, is also not the complete good.
So the ideal of the supreme good is the perfect union of both. The universe only makes sense to our pure practical reason if happiness is distributed in exact, flawless proportion to how moral someone is.
But when we look around at the physical world, it offers us absolutely no guarantee of this.
None. Lightning strikes the saint and the sinner equally. A corrupt person might live a long, comfortable life, while a deeply kind person suffers endlessly.
The physical world is entirely indifferent to your moral worth. Therefore, pure practical reason forces us to believe in something beyond the physical world.
Teleological unity.
Yes, the idea that the universe has an ultimate, purposeful moral design. In order for the moral law not to just be an idle, pointless dream, your own reason necessitates that you assume the existence of a supreme intelligence God who can actually dispense happiness in proportion to morality.
And it necessitates a future life, immortality, where this perfect distribution can actually take place.
There's a beautiful analogy brought in here from Leibniz, contrasting the kingdom of nature with the kingdom of grace.
It is a profound comparison. The kingdom of nature is the physical world we inhabit right now, governed by blind, unfeeling physical laws. Actions have physical consequences, but not necessarily moral ones.
But the kingdom of grace is an intelligible, moral world governed by the supreme good, where moral relations dictate the ultimate harmony of all things.
And Kant makes a very careful point to say that this moral theology doesn't give us permission to escape into fanaticism or ignore our earthly duties. It actually grounds us right here in the world.
It grounds us completely.
It tells us that we fulfill our destiny in this life by placing ourselves in harmony with the moral law. We don't obey moral laws just because they are arbitrary commands from a deity. We regard them as divine commands precisely because we are internally, rationally bound by them.
It is a strict warning against perverting reason. Moral theology teaches you to do the quiet, difficult work of being a good person here and now. But how do we hold on to these hopes? How do we justify them?
This brings us to a wonderfully psychological part of Kant's framework, examining the very nature of holding something to be true. He draws a line between mere persuasion and actual conviction.
This feels incredibly relevant today. Persuasion is described as a private illusion. It's when the reason you believe something lies solely within yourself. Maybe it's a gut feeling or a bias, but you mistakenly treat it as an objective fact.
It's valid only for you.
Exactly. Conviction, on the other hand, is valid for the reason of every single person. If you hold a true conviction, you can communicate it, and it will hold up against the scrutiny of other minds.
And Kant strictly breaks down the holding of a truth into 3 precise degrees: opinion, knowledge, and belief.
Let us define them carefully. Opinion is when your judgment is consciously insufficient, both subjectively and objectively. You know you don't have all the facts, and the facts themselves aren't enough to prove it to anyone else.
And Kant points out that you can't have an opinion in pure mathematics. You either know the geometry or you abstain from judgment entirely. You can't just say, well, in my opinion, a triangle has 4 sides.
You'd be laughed out of the room. The second degree is knowledge. Knowledge is sufficient both subjectively and objectively. It is a certainty for you and a certainty for everyone else.
But the third degree, belief, is where the architecture of the mind gets truly fascinating.
Belief is subjectively sufficient, meaning you hold it to be true with absolute firm confidence, but you recognize that it is objectively insufficient. You cannot mathematically prove it to the rest of the world.
There is an example used to walk us through the different types of belief that I found so clarifying. Take a doctor diagnosing a patient with a dangerous disease. The doctor doesn't have complete objective information. The symptoms are vague, but the doctor must take action to save a life.
They have to make a call.
So, based on the best judgment available, the doctor treats it as tuberculosis. Kant calls this a pragmatical belief. It's contingent, but it forms the ground for actual action.
And then there is the ultimate test of belief, the bet. Kant observes human nature so sharply here. You might hear someone speaking with incredible boldness and assurance, seemingly convinced they cannot be in error.
But then you challenge them to a wager.
And suddenly, the boldness vanishes.
It's the 18th century equivalent of someone being incredibly brave in an internet comment section, arguing with absolute certainty. But the second you ask them to bet their mortgage on that opinion, suddenly they discover nuance.
It is exactly that. If they are asked to bet one ducat, they might still speak loudly. But ask them to stake their entire life savings on their assertion, and they immediately become aware of the possibility of being mistaken. Their subjective confidence collapses when risk is introduced.
However, there is a type of theoretical judgment that holds weight even against a monumental bet.
Yes, Kant uses the example of alien life. He states that if there were a way to objectively test it, he would happily bet everything he owns that at least one of the planets we see is inhabited.
This isn't just a fleeting opinion. It is a strong doctrinal belief.
And that leads to the most important kind of belief in this entire philosophical structure: moral belief. Why is believing in God and a future life not a logical certainty, but a moral certainty?
Because in the sphere of morality, action is absolutely necessary. You must act in obedience to the moral law. And the only condition under which this moral law perfectly harmonizes with the ultimate ends of the universe is the existence of God and a future life.
You cannot boast that you logically, scientifically know there is a God, because logical knowledge can be perfectly communicated and mathematically proven to anyone.
Instead, it is a moral certainty.
It is a belief so deeply interwoven with your own moral nature that to tear it away would be to tear away your very humanity.
It's subjective, but it is unshakable. It's not a math equation. It's the bedrock of human purpose. Which makes me think about how we organize all this information in our minds. Kant introduces the concept of the architectonic of pure reason.
The art of constructing a system out of our knowledge.
He insists that your understanding of the world cannot just be an aggregate, a random, disorganized pile of unconnected facts you've picked up over the years.
No, it cannot just be a pile of building blocks added from the outside. Kant uses a powerful organic comparison here. A true system of scientific cognition is like an animal body. It is a living organism.
It grows from within.
When an animal body grows, it doesn't just bolt a new limb onto the outside. It strengthens every existing part from the inside, making it more active without changing the overall proportions. A true system of thought must grow the same way. It requires a schema, a blueprint determined a priori by the highest aims of your own reason.
This brings up a distinction that completely changes how you look at learning. Kant divides learning into historical cognition and rational cognition.
Let us examine this distinction because it is vital for how you interact with information in your own life. Imagine someone who memorizes a philosopher's entire system perfectly. They know every definition, every argument, every counter-argument.
But they only know what they have been told.
Exactly. Kant says this person is merely a plaster cast of a living man.
A plaster cast. That is such a haunting, precise image. It perfectly describes the feeling of just memorizing things for an exam without actually understanding them.
It is a hollow victory. They have the external shape of the knowledge, but not the internal life. This is historical cognition. To possess true rational cognition, you cannot just be an imitative faculty absorbing facts like a sponge.
You must draw the knowledge from the principles yourself.
You must originate it from your own reason. You cannot truly learn philosophy, Kant argues. You can only learn to philosophize.
You have to animate that plaster cast yourself. And when we look at the overarching structure Kant builds to help us do that, this grand architecture of pure reason, he divides philosophy cleanly into two parts.
The metaphysic of nature, which looks at what actually is, and the metaphysic of ethics, which looks at what ought to be.
And within the metaphysic of nature, he gently details four exquisite subparts. There is ontology, which is the system of conceptions relating to objects in general. There is rational physiology, which looks at nature as it is given to our senses.
Then rational cosmology, which examines the world as a total, complete whole.
And finally, rational theology, which attempts to connect nature to a being above nature. And I noticed how empirical psychology is treated in this architecture. Kant refers to it almost affectionately as a stranger who has been long a guest.
Yes. It is allowed to stay in the house of metaphysics for a time, simply out of economy, because it doesn't yet have a home of its own in the sciences. But eventually, it must find its proper place in anthropology. For Kant, true metaphysics must remain pure, uncontaminated by empirical observation.
To truly appreciate this massive structure, the book takes us on a quiet walk through the entire history of pure reason. It sketches the grand revolutions and how humanity has historically tried to understand reality.
A fascinating history.
It contrasts the sensualists, like Epicurus, who believed reality resides only in what we can physically sense and experience, against the intellectualists, like Plato, who argued that truth is found only in the understanding, and that the physical senses are merely the parents of illusion.
It is a history of brilliant minds pulling the human spirit in opposite directions. We see the empiricists, led by Aristotle and later John Locke, who believed all pure cognitions are ultimately derived from experience.
And opposing them are the noonologists.
Right. A noologist is someone who believes that knowledge originates purely in the intellect, or reason alone, independent of the senses. This camp was led by Plato and later Leibniz.
And finally, we look at the methods these thinkers use to try and prove their points. He contrasts the naturalists, who rely solely on common sense and reject rigorous science, with those who commit to a systematic scientific method.
And even among those scientific thinkers, there was a deep divide.
You had the dogmatic approach of philosophers like Wolff, who made bold assertions without examining reason's limits, and the skeptical approach of Hume, who doubted everything to the point of philosophical paralysis.
Which leaves only one path remaining. When you look back at all these ruined systems, all these fighters swinging at shadows, there's only one road that hasn't been blocked by illusion or despair.
The critical path. Kant's ultimate conclusion is that this critical path, this painful, humbling examination of reason's own limits that we've been tracing through all these pages, is the only one left open to us.
It's a narrow footpath, but if we walk it carefully, if you use your own mind to balance the strict limits of what you can possibly know with the boundless horizon of what you ought to do, you cease to be a mere plaster cast. You stop simply memorizing the thoughts of dead men and begin the quiet, profound work of becoming an active legislator of your own human reason. Because to truly think, you must realize that the strict boundary of your knowledge is not a cage. It is actually the very canvas on which your freedom is drawn. If pure reason could logically, mathematically prove everything, if we knew with absolute scientific certainty exactly what happens after we die, or exactly how a supreme intelligence evaluates us, we wouldn't actually be free to make moral choices at all. We would simply be following an equation, terrified into compliance. True human freedom, true moral worth, actually requires that quiet, uncertain darkness lying just beyond the edge of our knowledge.